All right, hi everybody. Welcome to the 12th Annual Women's Heart Symposium. I'm Nicole Weinberg. I'm here with Alexandra LaJoy, Christiane Schaeffler, and Sarina Vanderzee, and we represent the Women's Heart Center of Pacific Heart Institute and Have a Heart, Save a Heart charity. As always, we are here to bring you leading experts with cutting-edge medical information, but this year it's a bit more personal. Many in this room have been directly impacted by the wildfires. We are here to come together as a community. Sorry. That's why you don't speak. And rise up. The distraction with this meeting is a gift, and we want to make every moment count. Some of the celebration may take a little bit of a different tone this year, but make no mistake, we are here today to be strong. We are focusing on understanding genetics and our health this year and spotlighting many different ways to break down buzzwords like biohacking and longevity. As always, we'll be supporting other charities, and we think you'll be energized by the connections that we have made this year.
I just want to say it's so nice to see all of you guys here. We're continuing the hybrid format for this meeting along with our amazingly resilient AV team. With their help, we are putting our best foot forward to all of you online and immortalizing this meeting in our YouTube catalog. If you or a friend have missed some of the incredible information presented today, know that we will have it online for you, courtesy of Studio 721 in a few short days. So please tune in and share. For those of you in person, we hope you are enjoying our curated gift bags. This year's gift bags are heavy in the heart theme. We want you to be surrounded by love from us and our wonderful community. In our small way, we want to encourage you to take time for yourself moving forward. Journal, reflect, meditate, and think about your heart. You were given one, and we want you to take care of it with renewed energy this year. Additionally, we have so many raffle prizes, a larger retreat raffle, and an amazing gift shop filled with Have a Heart, Save a Heart swag. Don't worry if you have joined us virtually. We have a lot of fun in store for you today, too, including a little treat right now. Our virtual folks can enter the email raffle now for a chance to win a special gift bag from this year's meeting. Also in store for you, we have the amazing lawn to engage you through the chat function on the live stream. So ask your questions there, and don't forget to post pictures and videos on your social media and tag us at Have a Heart, Save a Heart.
For over a decade, we've been able to count on the amazing support of this community. We want to thank Pacific Heart Institute, our incredible staff, many of whom you met on the way in and are seeing throughout the room today, the Women's Heart Center at Pacific Heart Institute, and the St. John's Foundation for everything they've done. We also wanted to thank our board members at Have a Heart, Save a Heart, and our think tank, Sheil, Irene, Libby, Merle, and Lisa. We couldn't do this without you. We'd also like to thank our amazing sponsors. Please swing by their tables and learn about what they have to offer. This meeting could not happen without them, and we're very grateful for the generous support. If you haven't entered our raffle already, please do so. Buy some raffle tickets, and we'll be announcing the winners throughout the day. Lastly, please give a round of applause for our amazing volunteers, and thanks everyone for helping.
You may already be familiar with our annual Heart and Soul Wellness Retreat Raffle, which is back again and better than ever. Join us for a unique experience rooted in nature, self-care, community, and this retreat, facilitated by our friends at Sacred Heart Woman Collective in Topanga, is valued at about $1,000, can be yours for $125. While there, we'll indulge in artisanal cheese making, sound baths, heart-centered meditation, and more. Sign up at the retreat raffle table or register by email if you're with our virtual audience. We'll be drawing 50 names out of the bowl after lunch, and the date is May 31st, so check your calendar. Sign up now. There's no charge to enter, and if you're selected, it's $125 today.
We'll have a half-hour break halfway through the morning session, as well as an hour lunch break, so you can network while you stretch your legs. Don't forget, we'll be connecting with our virtual audience during that time, so feel free to post on social media, engage with our chat, ask questions for the panel discussions. During the breaks, we invite you to please patronize our exhibitors and check out our raffle items.
We're excited to have some residents in training here today, including those from MLK. Thanks for coming. We're offering CME and CEU credits for our MD, PA, RN, NP, PharmD, and PhDs this year. All credits will be going through Providence, so please follow the instructions if you want to get credits. Note that anyone wanting CEUs needs to check in, but it is not too late to do it if you haven't registered yet. If you are here in person, please find Nancy at the check-in table in the foyer. If you are watching the live stream and want CEUs, please enter your name into the chat now. If you are getting CMEs, please note that it will all be online, either in Cloud CME or using the QR codes you received in your email.
All right, I'm sure everyone will have a lot of questions, so we've scheduled a Q&A panel discussion at the end of the morning session to address all of those. We'll be passing around a microphone for those of us here, and our virtual attendees can submit their questions through the chat function, and we'll communicate those to the panelists. We're excited for a lively discussion.
All right. Without further ado, let's get the learning started. Dr. Ora Gordon is a nationally recognized expert in hereditary cancer and the regional medical director of the Center for Clinical Genetics and Genomics for Providence, Southern California. You may also know her as a professor of genetics at the St. John's Cancer Institute and associate professor of genetics at UCLA Geffen School of Medicine. Her impressive pedigree includes a multitude of training programs from Tulane to UCLA, everything from genetics to integrative medicine. As if that wasn't enough, she has also published extensively in academic journals, award-winning books, and 1 year ago, she was being dazzled by Dr. Barbara Natterson's keynote speech at our Women's Heart Symposium. Nicole asked her, we all asked if she could be our keynote speaker for 2025, and she agreed. We couldn't be more honored to present our keynote speaker for the Women's Heart Symposium in 2025. Please give a warm welcome to Ora Gordon. Dr. Ora Gordon.
Okay. Is there a laser on this? Hi, good morning, everybody. It is absolutely my pleasure to be here and to be your leadoff batter for this incredible session. And I do want to just take a moment to again extend to everyone who is here, personally affected, family affected by the fires. The fact that you showed up here today is extraordinary. It means that you are looking forward and looking towards health and protection of health for yourself and for your families. So the morning is going to draw across a lot of genomics and a lot of genetic information and then kind of really a little bit different perhaps than some of the other Save the Heart focuses. We're going to be talking a little bit more about cancer and a little bit more about non-cardiac directly. But I want to walk through this morning and I'm going to take you through sort of the journey of where precision medicine is now to lay the foundation for the rest of the speakers who are going to be terrific. So this has become the mantra of the last 15 years, precision medicine. And we hear it now, it's maybe become a little bit tired in how often it's used, but it really is the North Star for what we're looking at in medicine. How do we individualize care? How do we separate what used to be, we gather everybody together, we wanted huge amounts of data, kind of thinking about everybody as an equivalent group. And now there has been such a shift to say, you as an individual, how do you respond to medications? How likely are you to get a disease? How likely are you to respond to the treatment that we want to give you for this disease? And so this N of one philosophy is now pervading almost everything we do in medicine. Very briefly on a timeline, if you think about the world of genetics, it's a pretty young field. So it's 75 years really on the outside since DNA was discovered and our first kind of genetic syndrome, Down syndrome, was understood as to sort of why this was happening. So when you think about what has happened in the last 20 years, the amount of transformation is really extraordinary at its pace. The things that I just want to highlight, kind of some big things. So of course the Human Genome Project was what was transformational when we finally sequenced the human genome. It finished ahead of time and it created the platform to which we could then leverage all of this learning that we've been doing since then. The other thing that has happened is sort of this emergence of genomic sciences, the ability to look at big data all together and say, how does it influence? We used to be like, okay, one gene, one disease, but that's just not what happens in the body. And so being able to look at this really in a totality has changed the way we understand the kind of body's response, predisposition, and disease formation. Okay, so a little bit of a vocab. Pretty much you can put omics on the end of anything now, and it's become very, very frequent to hear about epigenomics and genomic medicine and metabolomics. You'll be hearing a little bit probably later from Dr. Wright. So just so that you understand, the omics part of it is saying we're looking at things all together, almost trying to say how is it functioning inside of the body as opposed to fractioning it out. Right? And so genomics versus genetics is really saying not just the DNA sequence, but what about the things that regulate it? What shuts it down? What makes it amplify? How does this happen on a response to insult, like carcinogens? How does the inflammation affect the heart in a totality? So that is what omic medicine is. So now I want everybody to take a minute, do this, on line 2, okay? And now say, Om-ix. This is how I start my day. But I think more so than anyway, today and always, we really do want to be heart-centered, and we really want to ground as much as we can. Okay, so there was a transformative force that happened about a decade ago, and this intersection was the ability to suddenly change how sequencing got done so that we could do it at the fidelity, being able to sequence at rapid and decreased cost, that there was the Moore's Law. When they did the Human Genome Project, the first sequencing of the human genome was in excess of $25 million to sequence one genome. And it took years. And then after that, it was really, for years, it was sitting at about $1 million per whole genome and taking months. Flash forward, now it takes us a day to do a whole genome, and the cost is under $1,000. So that transformation has allowed us to leverage and become accessible to really everyday medicine, the power of the genome. The other things that happen is big data, AI, all of these things integrating together have allowed us to be able to do the same thing, to say, now can we leverage, how do we leverage the power of big numbers to make it matter to the individual? Okay, so I wanted to, just in framing the beginning of today's session, to give you a little bit. I think we can't really talk about where we are now in the future state of precision medicine without understanding a little bit about really the brick and mortar of genetics, genetic testing, hereditary susceptibility. So I'm gonna roll you through in just 3 little sections. We're gonna kind of talk about what is genetics as genetic testing, what does it mean in current state? What is it where we are then moving into, some novel areas that we're moving into, and what's very important to me and where my career has been focused now is on what I call population genomics, really being able to reach individuals who don't yet know they're at risk and trying to find that and really trying to, again, make this risk stratification to say, do you need higher surveillance? Can you go to less frequent surveillance? What do I need to do to take care of you? And yes, my career is focused on cancer, and then as our day goes on, but I do all hereditary adult diseases, and so really using cancer as the paradigm is the same for all adult common diseases. What we understand in terms of the fraction that has a single high-risk genetic susceptibility, understanding what we call familial vulnerability, and how do we separate what we used to call sporadic, that really probably there's nothing that's truly sporadic, that you have a genomic vulnerability and something about your environment puts you in that position to get that disease. So, I don't know, you don't have to lift your hands, but if you have had any genetic testing, anything from when you were getting ready to get pregnant, or while you were pregnant, as a course of your family history for cancer, for heart disease, for otherwise, people step into genetic testing often kind of coming from two places. Either I am, an information seeker and knowledge is power and I want to be informed for myself and my family, or why would I want that? I may just bring on risk, or I may just be worried about things that I don't know what to do anything about. For me, I have never done genetic testing if I didn't have an intervention that I could do something about. Whether that meant from a prevention standpoint or a disease modification standpoint, or simply being able to inform somebody so that they could anticipate what they needed to do in terms of their life care. That these are all spectrums of things that can do to make that powerful. There are a lot of women in this room. There are some gents too, which is wonderful. But women are the drivers of healthcare for their families. And so genetics is a family affair. You step in on behalf of your family, and that you are then kind of bringing everyone in terms of understanding that risk and really understanding the reassurance. More often than not, we reduce risk. We tell people that they've been worried all this time, but in fact, they're unburdened from that. There are three different kinds of genetic results. Just to be clear, we're not going to get into the weeds on that, but you can be positive. So in this way, it's sort of the reverse. Positive meaning we find something that is different. You have a mutation that puts you at elevated risk. It can be normal, which is negative, right? Which is kind of the converse of how we think about things. And then there is this intermediate result called an uncertain significance. We spend a lot of time kind of processing that through. The more people we test and the more we have for reference information and the more diversity in terms of our ethnic diversity to build this bank of our reference sequences, the fewer of these variants of uncertain significance there are. So not all mutations or pathologic variants can be found at any one time. If you have had genetic testing, for example, for cancer in the past, you may have had BRCA testing, which is commonly called BRCA testing. It evolved 4 times over the course of since it was the first available as a clinical test. It has changed 4 times because we have increased ability to recognize mutations and different changes in that DNA. There's not that you in your own body that DNA is changing. It's just that our molecular ability to find it has evolved and improved. And that when you talk about susceptibility for an adult disease, with very rare exception, it does not say you will get this. It says you are at elevated risk. And then we spend a lot of time trying to really nuance that risk. And that since many of these genes have now been discovered, what the new kind of what we're doing in the 2020s now is saying, how do we modify that? Okay, you have a BRCA mutation, or you have a colon cancer gene, or you have a gene that puts you at risk for cardiomyopathy. How do we understand why 5 people in your family got disease and you're 85 and you never got disease? How do we get everybody else to be in that place where their modifiers don't allow that to present? People say, well, how do you do it? Like, it's really easy. It's either a blood test or a spit swab tests, and it has, these are now equal for almost all tests. That doesn't matter whether you do saliva or blood, just that saliva sometimes fails because we just don't get enough DNA. During COVID, everything went to online and remote, and we're doing a lot of saliva. We had a lot of bacon DNA coming in, and so we had to be a little clearer about give your sample before you have your breakfast, that kind of stuff. But other than that, we can tell. You may not be able to tell it in your own family, but we can actually tell, the pig from the person. So, just so that you know, and that insurance coverage had just expanded and expanded. So where it had been very narrow and very restrictive even 10 years ago to get genetic testing covered, and we used to have to go one gene at a time, and they were thousands of dollars each, very high burden of cost for patients, hard to get coverage. Now it is really the almost to the floor in terms of being able to get coverage for molecular testing, and if you have to pay cash, the beautiful thing about the patent getting overturned and changing all this is that now the out-of-pocket cost for almost all genetic tests is about $250. We test for hundreds of genes at the same time. So again, it's this crossroads of being able to get access as well as the incredible increase in the amount of information. Okay, so let me just blow you through a little primer on hereditary cancer. Again, just so as we move forward, you can kind of understand sort of the building blocks and then to where we've moved now. So this is where it gets a little confusing. And then later this morning, when Dr. Ofman talks about how do we detect cancer, and this is another area that I've been very involved in, that it's hard to separate the genetics of a tumor from the genetics of the person. So we use language and we say somatic, meaning that this is a change that happened in a cell in your body that then mutated and a series of errors let that become a dysregulated cell that became cancerous. It can happen in the lung, it can happen in the skin, it can happen in the colon. If you have a hereditary susceptibility, every cell in your body, you are born with one genetic change. That first genetic change puts you at perhaps 1 in a million times more likely to acquire that second or third hit. You got to get all those, it has to be a series of errors, and our body is very good at trying to clear out cancer cells, just like it clears out bacteria and viruses. If it's abnormal, our immune system says, don't like that, we want to take it out. So the forces, again, when we talk about like this genomics or the environmental, what happens that allows that cell to continue to propagate? So this is the classic, it was called this two-hit hypothesis. And you can just see here, so the hereditary cancer, and you have it in every cell. You may only be at risk for cancer of the pancreas or cancer of the heart, or excuse me, of the breast or the ovaries, but every cell in your body has that genetic vulnerability. That's why we can take saliva, we can take blood, and we can find that underlying susceptibility. So this is like the pie, and anybody who is, in cancer, we always talk about kind of what's the fraction of the pie that is due to a single gene or hereditary susceptibility. We used to say it was less than 5%, then it was 10%, now it's 15%. Basically, the more we test, the more we find. And because of this, the benchmark to say, do you need genetic testing, germline testing for cancer susceptibility keeps lowering and lowering and lowering, because what we're finding is that those rigid criteria that we used to say you had to have the neon sign kind of family, 3, 4, 5 people, they had to be diagnosed super early, we had to have more than one cancer. Yes, that is very true, and those are very important families that need evaluation, but you can have one person in the family, you can be the only person affected in the family and have a underlying germline mutation. So when we talk about this, and the biopsy I get to do most often is the genetic biopsy, there are 3 kind of categories. And just to orient you on a family tree or pedigree here, okay, so this is the grandparents, so from the kids, sibs, parents or grandparents, right? Women are circles, men are squares, because men are squares. And so here's kind of when we think about sporadic cancer. It's one person, they're later onset in their disease, and everybody else hasn't gotten anything. Then we move to the familial. There's more than, we're kind of seeing a cluster of cancer. Maybe it's both generations, but it doesn't tend to, both genders, but it doesn't tend to be super onset. And then this classic hereditary, super early onset, one generation after another, and that this is, the hallmark of the hereditary susceptibility. This big sporadic piece of the pie is where we're now whittling down more and more. And I'm going to talk to you very briefly about kind of how we're trying to address what this appears to be in terms of sporadic cancer. You can still be at elevated risk for cancer, and we just don't know what cancer that may be. And then when we talk about the ability to try to transform how we screen for cancer and looking at more cancers at once is just that. As a single individual, you don't really get to pick what cancer you're at risk for. When you're at hereditary risk, we can often make a short list and say these are the things you're at high risk for. But for everybody else, it sort of depends on whether or not you have particular environmental exposure or it's just years on the planet. So I had mentioned this earlier. So back, when I finished my fellowship and we first started doing genetic testing, it was one gene at a time. Just to give you an example, the BRCA or the BRCA testing, BRCA 1 and 2 were tested together. The cost of that testing was $4,000. And then if it was negative, and I said, well, I think there might be another genetic syndrome, then I had to go to my next gene and do that, and it would take 5 or 6 weeks, and that would be several $1,000s that I try to march them down this way. Now we test for it routinely between 50 and 100 cancer susceptibility genes, all cancer susceptibilities. So pancreas, endometrial, for breast, ovary, all at the same time. And it costs $250 or less and almost always covered by insurance. This is just a little list of kind of the things, if this is in your family or in your personal history, these are like the single indicator of reasons why we want to do genetic testing. Very importantly for women, ovarian cancer is one of the highest genetic susceptibility cancers. So it's this inverse. The more common the cancer, the more there are other different influences in terms of environmental, hormonal, other kinds of things. The rarer the cancer, the more likely that the underlying genetic susceptibility is the main driver. Oops. In men, we had for a long time just ignored prostate cancer, but just so that you know, again, as kind of the conduits of information for your families, that hereditary prostate cancer is a very real and substantial form of underlying risk for the much more aggressive forms of prostate cancer, sort of that two pathways of disease, the benign, indolent, very late onset, and the aggressive, threatening kind. Breast cancer, which is the most common cancer in women, is much more mixed in terms of how much of it is underlying from a single gene. We have over a dozen genes for breast cancer. We test for them all at the same time now. And then this polygenic risk, which I'll talk about in a moment. Sometimes cancers cluster in families because of the environmental, whether it's vulnerability to solar damage, skin cancers. Interestingly, there are clusters of Hodgkin's disease, which are probably due to an underlying shared viral exposure, and then, of course, carcinogenics. So we have to unpack that, sort that all out. Just a moment on polygenic risk. I could give you a whole talk on polygenic risk because this is where we've moved from the single gene. When we do single gene testing, if we can't find a BRCA or a Lynch syndrome or another gene, and then we see, hey, well, how do we then say, do you need high-risk surveillance? Do I need to do an MRI of the breast for you? Do I need to have you start earlier? What about taking preventive medications? So now I routinely use something called polygenic risk. And when you think about the bell curve, right? If you are on this end, this is the lowest end of the risk, and these tiny little variants, how are these cards dealt for you? Might be 100 and maybe 1,000 of these tiny variations that we can look at in aggregate. By themselves, they don't mean anything, but all together, they put you on this spectrum. And if you're shifted far to the left or shifted far to the right, and we do this for cardiovascular disease, we do this risk for arrhythmias, we do it for a whole variety of cancers, for type 2 diabetes. So it's now really moving into the domain of common disease to say, are you more vulnerable, and how can I intercede before you present with disease? I always say, if you show up in my office and you have had, a myocardial infarction at the age of 40, or you show up with ovarian cancer, I have missed my opportunity for prevention. And so this is how I am now trying to really move this into the place where all patients can have access. So just to compare, so if we do a single gene test and you have a BRCA, it comes back, it says it's positive, and then we know these very specific risks associated with it. Polygenic, you get something on a risk score, right? So if you're way out here as an outlier, and this tends to be the 95th, 99th percentile, then it really meaningfully pulls apart those curves. You may be 2, 3, 4 times more likely to have a disease. If you're all the way down at the bottom, you may be at half. So when we start to talk about, should I have a mammogram every 2 years? Should I have it every year? Do I need to add an MRI? Really being able to sort out where you are on this bell curve can really help for any one individual. We do it for prostate cancer screening. We can do it for colon cancer, the decision about whether to take aspirin. We do it for coronary artery disease. Do you need a calcium score? Do you need to get on a statin earlier? So this is how we're trying to really land this into everyday care. This is in the weeds, but just to reinforce that depending on where you are in this level of risk, for example, for breast cancer, we're going to do one thing if you're at high risk and something else if you're at average risk. And so that for even within one family, we may treat people in the same family totally differently based on what that risk level is. And then it rolls in. Okay, so I might be coming in because I'm worried about breast cancer, but I find out I have a BRCA mutation. Now I'm talking about, having to take out my ovaries potentially premenopausally. Well, how's that going to impact my cardiovascular risk? How do we have to put all this together. No patient is just one single disease. So we have to do that in a really comprehensive way to say, where's the risk balance? If everyone in your family has early onset coronary artery disease, we want to stave off potentially that early menopause and try to do that balance of where is the best risk benefit for any one person. Same thing with using hormone replacement. All of those decisions interweave with all the rest of their risk. Okay, so who should have genetic testing? I think pretty much everybody. But as we try to say, okay, what does that really mean? So again, here are kind of your big flags, what we call the single indicators. If you have one person with pancreatic cancer in your family, that is a single indicator, undergo genetic testing if you and your family choose to. Same thing with ovarian cancer, single indications, right? Person who has triple negative or hormone negative breast cancer, this is where we've raised the roof. First we said if you had triple negative breast cancer under the age of 60, now we say at any age. We used to say breast cancer had to be earlier than the age of 50. Now there's a movement to say breast cancer at any age because we just keep finding these genetic susceptibilities that not only tell us are there treatments that are better for that one individual, but also their future risk. Okay, so I have declared Thanksgiving National Family History Day. You come to my house, there's an easel or a pad. All right, everybody gets like, hi, how are you? Mwah, mwah, mwah. What's up with your family, your personal history? Please put your medical conditions down here and then go get the mashed potatoes. It's a lot of fun. But it is an opportunity. Think about it. You gather. There is precious amount of information. If we, for those of you who have been impacted by the fires, and you think about what you lose, what do we have? We have our collective memory, and then our parents and grandparents, that trust, that kind of collective memories and brain trust is a finite treasure. So we want to try to get the best information that we can. It's not that hard to ask. There have been a lot of studies on how accurate people are in terms of reporting their family history, surprisingly accurate for themselves and for kind of their nuclear family, and then it gets pretty soft after that. We give people all kinds of tools. If you're a genealogist, not a geneticist, right? You can there are all kinds of public records, all kinds of ways to actually get information to clarify things. Sometimes people think that, oh, grandpa, he had pancreatic cancer, and then we get a death certificate, and he had an infection. And so suddenly you've changed the whole, narrative in terms of risk for their family. So I do encourage everybody to try when they're together, whenever that is, to really just help to kind of take away the stigma of talking about health and disease, and to the power of that information to be able to help inform the next generation. Okay, so just touching base for just a moment, let's have on show of hands who has had a 23andMe test or an Ancestry.com test or a National Geographic. Okay, so absolutely no shame, totally good. There's great information. So I just want to kind of give a few key bars, though, because 23andMe, as part of their mission for delivery, really wanted to push the envelope in saying the same thing. What I do for population genomics is say we want to bring genetic information to the individual and take away that barrier of having to go to the doctor and have to kind of deal with all of that to have it. So they moved more and more from just ancestry and traits like can you roll your tongue and does your pee smell when you eat asparagus, all those kinds of things, to saying, no, we can do, as a proof of principle, we can provide genetic risk information, and people are able to take that information without a medical intervention as a provider, and then take that information to their provider and have that be actionable. What I want to caution, if that's what you have done, so now they're very, very careful about having people be very clear about what they're consenting for. In the early days, it was a default to, you sort of got everything unless you opted out. You also were sharing all of your DNA unless you opted out. And the opt-out was like on page 5,000 in font 4, where there was a little box for you to check. So that's what got 23andMe into trouble. So they have really changed that now, and so it's very transparent in the front. Everything that you choose, information sharing, what information you do and don't want for your health risks or just the fun traits, right? It's fun to say, like, does your DNA show that your hair is curly or you're gonna be bald? Now, you can look in the mirror and get that answer, but it's kind of nice to get that reinforcement. What has happened, though, is that by extension, when they started adding disease susceptibilities, it's very narrow what they can see and not see due to the platform of the way it works. So for BRCA, they started resulting BRCA. The only BRCA changes that they are reporting is 3 changes specific to Eastern European Jewish people, the Ashkenazi founder mutations, we call them. But it explains that if you go in and you read everything, there's good data. But if you don't, you just say, oh, look, my BRCA test was negative. There are 2,000 mutations in BRCA alone. So they test for 3 of 2,000. So it's how you interpret that information. The same thing with the other, there are just a few here listed, right? Late onset Alzheimer's disease. To me, that's not the way I want that information transmitted for my patients, to just read something that says you're at elevated risk for Alzheimer's disease. I don't think that that's an empowering way to provide that information, because it needs a lot to sort of understand what it means and how it translates in terms of real risk and what might be done about it. Okay. Also, always want to just talk about GINA, the Non-Discrimination Act. People are very worried still, and providers, those of you in the room, if you keep telling patients, like, be afraid about genetic information because you can be discriminated against, it's really time to let that go. We have enough information that it's very clear where there are vulnerabilities to genetic discrimination and where there aren't. In employment and health, now the ACA Act basically took away the ability to do any genetic discrimination. Whether that will change in the next administration is probably not on the first deck of things that they want to change, but it makes everybody very nervous. But it's been, and in California, we have the best protections for anti-discrimination that is very pervasive. There are some states that actually have protection for life insurance and disability insurance as well. Those are areas of vulnerability in most states, so these are the kinds of things we talk about with people. A young person comes in and they want to do genetic testing because they have a hereditary cardiomyopathy. We say, get your life insurance in place ahead of time, because that way there's nothing for you to need to disclose. If you withhold, very rarely will an insurer say, do you have a genetic mutation putting you at risk? But if they ask and you don't answer truthfully, then you devoid your policy. But if you don't have information to share, then that's kind of in the place to do it. So it is really to try to reassure, and we have test case and we have cases that have come through to the courts, all showing the very strong protection against genetic information. There used to be that if you had a disease, if you've had an MI, if you have had cancer, that you are automatically in a different bracket in terms of your insurance risk, and that has also been tried to be leveled so that it doesn't create a pre-existing condition that is sort of in perpetuity going forward. All right, so in close, now I want to kind of just move into where we are in the future state and where are things going. So this is a little bit busy, I'm sorry, but what I really want to draw to your attention is that there are 3 different categories of genetic diseases that have such high frequency in the population and are so interventionable that the Center for Disease the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, have called them CDC Tier 1, meaning we should be looking for these in everybody. Familial hypercholesterolemia. In general, about 1 in 250 or 1 in 200. You'll see the next slide that in people who have atherosclerotic heart disease, that maybe is up high as 1 in 20. BRCA, right? So that's your breast, ovary, and prostate and pancreatic cancer syndromes. And then Lynch syndrome, which is a colon endometrial syndrome where it puts you at very high risk. These are the most common. Altogether, it's more than 1% of the population that may have one of these. There are almost 200 people in this room. There are at least 2 of you in here that have a genetic susceptibility, whether you know it or not. This is why we're trying to get to the population-based approach as opposed to only the neon sign family history approach. Why did this matter? Because there were a bunch of studies that said family history is really relevant, but it is not the end-all answer to say who is at risk and who's not at risk. When looking at big studies of people going through whole genome or whole exome studies for research, about 1 in 200 had a BRCA mutation, no family history, no idea they would be at risk, 1 in 200. Of those who had a family, who had a genetic susceptibility, half did not have family history that would have met criteria for testing, and 80% had never been tested before. So that really indicated like we are just missing lots of people at risk. The same thing with familial cholesterolemia, that the detection for FH, that only 1% of people who are probably at risk are being detected, and that often when they are detected, it is after they've already had an event. And again, it's sort of too far downstream from where we're trying to really get people to know that they're at risk and to be able to intervene. So this is a staggering statistic. 90% of people who carry a genetic susceptibility to cancer don't know. So when I first came to Providence, I was at Cedars, and I'm a professor at UCLA, and we teach, but I said, okay, how do we do this better? So we created this really easy screen and says, okay, if you have one yes to any of these questions, these are these single indicators for cancer genetic testing. There's a yes, you hand that in, then they tell you, okay, we taught the text, okay, it looks like you may have an increased risk. Stop by on your way out after your mammogram. Like, you can't actually get out the door without passing genetics. Just stop by and make an appointment. How successful was it? Just throw it out there. Give me, what percent of people came in for an appointment? Less than 2%. We looked at 15,000 of these surveys, less than 2%. 30% of people met criteria. 30, 1 in 3 women coming in for mammogram met genetic testing criteria. Like, okay, that seemed easy, did not work. What do we need to do? So we said, okay, let's try to make this a little more interactive. Let's try to make it a little more engaged and give people some anticipation that this is happening, and offer them same-day testing. When they come in for their mammogram, they're already thinking about prevention. They're already thinking oriented towards, their risk. Let's see if we can get better results from that. So we started an app-based survey that just kind of asks you these questions. It starts the week before your mammogram, reminds you the day before, and then if not, when you're coming in. This is, we started in Southern California. It's now going through any of the province. We're extending it through all the province hospitals. Will be 50 hospitals that have this ability, and we're moving it from mammogram to also be able to address more of our men, so like in endoscopies for colonoscopy centers, and now we're having our first test case that we're going to be building it out for cardiovascular disease. But okay, so this is just some numbers to show you the impact, and this is actually now, we are north of 200,000 women who have been offered these assessments. It's over 80% that complete it. And then when you kind of go down the funnel, this is 500 plus, so almost actually 650 of these mutations have been found in people who had no idea that they were at risk. So not only does it transform for them, but it transforms for their family. So here's Molly. She came in for her mammogram. She had genetic testing on that day, and she was found to carry a BRCA2 mutation. So in addition to her then being sent to for a high-risk kind of assessment and making decision-making, and again, thinking about all of this care as it relates to everything in her risk, her cardiovascular risk, her risk for cancer, her bone health, all of these things in a holistic way to be able to make the best decisions for her. She was at elevated risk for pancreatic cancer. We have a high-risk pancreatic cancer. Then she brings in her whole family. Her dad's positive. Turns out her dad has aggressive prostate cancer. He had no idea. It was only vis-a-vis her testing that drew him in to then be identified that we could catch an early stage aggressive prostate cancer. Okay, so the very last part of my talk is really about where we are in this genomics medicine. So you've heard about these forces that have brought this all to a place where we're really moving towards population-based genomic health. Pharmacogenomics, to me, is one of the most exciting domains for where we're going to be able to make huge differences in how we take care of our patients. What is pharmacogenomics? It's saying, how do you respond individually to drugs? Will it make you sick? Will you respond? Will it not work? And can we choose a therapy based on your genetic makeup and response to medications? And this is now moved into an enormous variation of medications that are intensely responsive to the individual's pharmacogenomics. There are FDA black box labels on over 200 drugs, but we have not been looking at this. They're there to say, if you are a non-responder, you should not take this drug. If you are a hypermetabolizer, you may get very sick and should not take this drug. You are likely to respond. But we have not integrated that into our everyday care. And this is where I hope that we start to really move that dial to. So looking at it for cardiology, it is really saying, where's the right dose at the right time? This is really important related to Plavix, because you can be a non-responder, and we have not been integrating this into the decisions about whether somebody, after they've had an acute myocardial event, should be put on clopidogrel or not. It's so prevalent in some populations that apparently Australia has now said that Plavix should not be the first-line drug, and that nobody should be taking it unless they have had PGX to say that they're going to be a responder. But the idea is to really optimize who's going to respond and then use an alternate therapy for somebody who's not. The same thing in psychiatry. So when you're thinking about implementing somebody on an antidepressant drug, historically, right, it's trial and error. We just throw one out and then see how you do. But when the PGX was the decision-making ahead of time to say, let's choose therapy, let's just hold on to get that information back and then make a selection, the adherence to medication, the time to response, and the side effects were all totally in the favorable way. And the cost differential from adverse events and having drug adverse events is really very impactful, and this is what's making insurers and health systems now starting to stand up and take notice. So this is the last thing. I was just at the Precision Medicine World Conference for the last few days, and there were two things that were really exciting about it. One was that there was an entire track on women, genomics and women's health, and the Luminary Award went to Renee Bianchi for her work in reproductive genetics and genomics. But there were amazing sessions, things like preeclampsia and its influence on cardiovascular disease, endometriosis and long-term disease in women, like all of these things that we have always thought of as being sort of partitioned, being part of the life continuum and being so important. The other thing was one that we'll see whether it sticks or not. So obviously now drugs for weight loss are so pervasive, the drugs that were originally for diabetes. And so there was a very interesting series of data that came out of the Mayo Clinic that said, can we look at what type of your phenotype or what type of obesity you are at risk for? do you have a hungry brain? Do you have a hungry gut? Are you an emotional eater? These kind of, are you a slow, kind of a slow metabolizer? And then by stratifying people, looking at their pharmacogenomics and their polygenic risk, so putting all this together, saying, are you likely to respond to one type of intervention for weight loss versus another? And so this was some really interesting data sort of showing, depending on what kind of phenotype there were and whether they were there, where they were on this polygenic risk, how they were going to respond. And so from that, they came up with 4 categories of, depending on what kind of phenotype your obesity was, where you're most likely to respond or not respond. And from that, they had a risk stratification of how they were going to intervene for people to be able to predict whether you were likely to actually respond to a PGL1 inhibitor or not. I mean, for the cost of these drugs and for the potential for patients having good response or side effects, it may really be a place where we can make a big difference. It is clinically available, but it is really just to market, and so I think this is sort of the early inspiration. So we did a population genomics study that I was the principal investigator for. It was an open invitation. We're really trying to get underrepresented populations within the health system to engage in genomic medicine. From that, we looked at 80 genes, cancer risk, cardiovascular risk, and pharmacogenomics. The pharmacogenomics was limited to these drugs. So we asked people if they were on them. Then we did a whole PGX panel. And then if it was positive, as a pilot, said, okay, can we have our pharmacist call the provider, call the patient, explain what this PGX means in terms of, are they on a medication they need to change? Can that intervention happen? And so this was the list of drugs that people had immediately actionable. Most of them were proton pump inhibitors, medications that are being given for people who have acid reflux or GERD. But there were a number of individuals who were on anticoagulants or antiplatelets and then on behavioral health medications. 100% of people who took that had something that in the future would be an influence on their medication decision making. So this has driven us to say we need to do the PGX up front for everybody as much as we can, and then have that information built into Epic so that when there is ordering, that there can be decision making being made in real time with the physician or the provider being able to say, oh, this person has a PGX response that makes this a great choice or a terrible choice. So these are the 3 now programs that are available. If your lives are touched by a Providence facility anywhere across the Pacific Northwest. So the prevention for me is the hereditary risk, and our hyperlipidemia. We're going to be doing that same day kind of point of care testing for anybody who is eligible. The pharmacogenomics is just rolled out, and in fact, our first site was the primary care clinic in the Pacific Palisades, and we were incredible providers who've been very engaged in all of our population genomics, and they're so committed that even though their clinic was lost and they've been dislocated, they want to continue this pilot and to be doing this for behavioral health in particular, as well as pain medication. And then multi-cancer blood tests, so that's something that I've been very involved in. You're going to hear a little bit more about that with Dr. Ofman. So if you're not part of Providence, for those online or aren't here, there is an initiative that is by the National Institute of Health that is doing kind of the same thing, really trying to get 1 million people and reporting back cancer susceptibility, cardiovascular susceptibility, and pharmacogenomics. But there's no tie to care. So you just sort of get this information, and then you have to bring it to your provider and have to have them navigate kind of helping you through that. So I just want to close by thanking you all for your attention and saying I think that genomic first care is here. It is no longer kind of the future. It is really for now. And that by engaging and participating, you can empower yourselves and for your family to have information that will keep you healthy and safe and optimize your wellness going forward. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gordon. We would like to present you with a Keynote Speaker Award today. We can't thank you enough for what you do in the name of heart health and genetics. And we know we speak for everyone when we say thank you. Next, we'd like to bring up Dr. Richard Wright. This year, Dr. Wright is getting the Distinguished Award of Master in American College of Cardiology. This distinguished award is only given to select people who have served on the board for more than 15 years. You may know Dr. Wright as a master, but we know him as the patriarch of our practice. When disaster struck recently, he and Sally offered their home with the help of some neighbors in the community to help those of us that are displaced. This is one of the many reasons why we know of Pacific Heart Institute as our family. Without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Richard Wright.
Well, thank you, Nicole. One thing I love about this conference is when Nicole asks me to speak, she gives me decision-making capabilities. So she said, what do you want to talk about? I said, I don't know. And so what I decided to do was to talk about something that every day I get questioned about. Any of you who've come to see me as a patient know that I measure your belly circumference every visit. Okay? It's not the most favorite moment of somebody's interaction with me. But they always ask me the question, why do you measure my belly circumference? You're a cardiologist, you know. And what I try to tell them is that measuring that circumference is more important than measuring blood pressure for me to predict cardiovascular events. So we're going to talk about this today, and I've labeled the talk Toxic Waste, because what I hope to convince you is that what happens physiologically and anatomically to the body that manifests as belly increased circumference telegraphs a lot about an individual's likelihood of developing cardiovascular events. And indeed, there are biologic and actually genomic and epigenomic reasons for this, and that's what we're going to talk about. So the question is toxic waste in your genes? Are you predisposed to have this? Or is it just in your genes? And that it's something beyond what the blueprint of your genetic code has manifest. These are my disclosures. None of these have anything to do with today's talk. So first, all of you have had your height and weight entered into your electronic health record or your paper chart or whatever, and from that comes this derived BMI index, and everybody always asks me what their BMI is and stuff. And it turns out BMI is used by insurance companies, by payers, by pharmacy benefit managers. For example, if you want to get on one of the obesity drugs, the GLP-1 receptor agonists like Ozempic and Mounjaro and stuff, you need to have your BMI in there because they consider BMI to be some miraculous predictor of cardiovascular events. And I want to dispel that, okay, because it turns out BMI is incredibly misleading at times. Yes, it's true on these red lines. These are the predictiveness of increasing BMI with regards to your future likelihood of developing cardiovascular events. So is there a rough correlation between BMI and your personal likelihood of having a heart attack or dying of a cardiovascular event? The answer is yes, there is. And that's true both for men on the left and women on the right. And the slopes are similar for these two genders, although men, because we have a higher incidence earlier in life, the incidence rate is higher. But there is a connection between BMI and cardiovascular death, which is the vertical axis here. So at least there is a little information that's obtained from that. But it turns out there are many reasons why this is the case. So let me go through a few things that make BMI less useful. As a cardiologist, most of my patients are older. If you look at the average weight of patients in our society, weight goes down with age, okay? Is that because 85-year-olds are better at dieting or whatever? No, it's because fat people die off, right? So the reason that weight is lower as you're older is because the older people are the ones who are the survivors, right? And a lot of times people conflate these things, but that's the truth. If you look at obesity distribution in the United States, The red here is where obesity is more prevalent. And you can see that here in Southern California, if you look around the room, and when I speak in Oklahoma or Alabama or Mississippi, big difference, right? And that's displayed on this map. And if you look at heat maps of stroke deaths or number of peripheral arterial interventions or amputations of feet or whatever, it mimics this very, very closely. Now, it's hard for me to believe that the genetics in the United States are strikingly different in Alabama than they are in Seattle. And indeed, that would argue that there are tremendous external influences. Yes, that there may be an underlying genetic component, and I'll show you that in a second. But the BMI, which is what this is obesity based on BMI, is distorted by something like this, right? That this gentleman, our former governor, was obese at this moment in time because according to the BMI, his BMI was greater than 30 because the scale can't differentiate whether you have belly mass or big biceps, right? Can't distinguish that. So that's one of the problems with BMI. And it's why it really should be abandoned. I don't think that there's any cogent reason why we need BMI because we have better markers. Now, I just did last week an AI search asking my computer, family history and obesity, okay? And here's what it says. Family history of obesity is a significant risk factor for obesity in children and adults. This is because obesity has a strong genetic component. This is one of the facts that's not a fact, actually. I'll show you the data here in a minute. But it goes on to say something that is true, okay? Which is that parents are role models for their children's eating and activity habits. And a lot of the reason there's a family history that correlates with obesity is because family history is not the same as genetics, right? Family history incorporates a lot of other things. Do you live next to the freeway? Do you inhale air that has particulate matter or smoke or whatever? Do your parents overeat? Do you live in a nutritional desert? Millions of things that have nothing to do with genetics, but those are incorporated into family history. So it turns out family history for this disease process is actually more important than the genetic code because there are important environmental influences, and that's the point of the talk today. So if you look at family history and weight, they clearly track together. If you look at certain things on the left here, which is low weight, well, it turns out low weight doesn't really correlate with family, but obesity, if you have obese family members, you're way more likely to be obese yourself. Now, some people might argue that that's because genes predict obesity. I want to dispel that. Genes influence the likelihood of obesity, but the environmental influences are actually much, much more important. Height and weight track together. And height is genetically determined. Yes, there's a nutritional component, but for the most part, height is pretty genetically determined. So if you just look at weight alone, tall people weigh more, and therefore genetics does have an influence on weight because genetics predict height quite closely. And in fact, if you want to get more if you look at my role as an echocardiographer, measurements of the heart really correlate very, very strongly with height. We use body surface area, which is inadequate. Height is a more important marker because that's genetically predicted, and in fact, the size of your heart is genetically predicted as well. If you look at exercise, exercise and weight are correlated. If you do more exercise, you're less likely to be obese. All of these things are influenced by your family. If both of your parents are marathon runners, you're probably going to do more exercise. And I don't think that there's a genetic predisposition per se for exercise. So if we do this and then use that logic, family history actually influences what are you eating, right? Are you eating highly processed foods, or are your parents both vegans? That's going to have an important influence. It influences exercise, and it influences the family history and environment are very closely related. As I said, do you live next to the chemical plant, for example? Genetics may influence eating and exercise. There may be genetic predispositions to being an exerciser. Maybe you have different muscle fibers, for example, and maybe that influences whether you choose to exercise or not, and maybe it influences eating. Dr. Gordon showed a slide there that suggested that that may be the case. We don't think that genetics influence the environment. If you have a certain gene profile, does that mean you're more likely to have a bad environment? Not sure that's the case. But we do know that the opposite is, in fact, the case. That the environment doesn't influence the blueprint. It doesn't influence the DNA that you've inherited, but it absolutely influences the expression of the genes. And that's actually the more important thing, because as you heard, genes can be turned on and turned off, right? It's the regulation of the genes that's the most important thing. And now we know that the environment has a very important role in modulating the expression of your genes. Environment in the broadest sense. As an example, the environment in your gut, right? Your microbiome, the trillion bacteria that live in your gut, influence genetic expression in the body because these bacteria exude substances which alter genetic expression. And hence the environment has a very important role in things that would eventually physiologically manifest, including, for example, do you get fat or not? And the local cellular environment for sure influences it. And the genesis of this talk was 2 important papers that came out in the last 6 months about exactly that fact, that what you do influences genetic expression that has a lingering effect. And that's one of the central questions we're going to talk about. So if you go back to, you heard about whole genome analyses. If you look in cardiology, yes, I do gene testing all the time. We do gene testing, as you heard Dr. Gordon talk about, for cardiomyopathy and for genetic inheritable diseases that afflict the heart. And currently we send 102 gene panel, and it's usually $249 or free. But none of those things influence whether you're going to get fat or not. There's somewhere between 30 and 50 genes, and if you put that into the whole program of a whole genome analysis in a very large population like the United Kingdom, Biobank, et cetera, is there an influence of genetics on weight? And yes, there is. And in fact, left to right are various things. For example, do you have high blood pressure? Do you have a low HDL cholesterol? Here's your BMI. Are you going to become diabetic? Notice that some of these, there's a slight correlation between your whole genome analysis and your likelihood in your lifetime of having these. Triglycerides is actually pretty high. These are all related, right? If you're fat, you're going to have a high BMI, you're going to have a high triglyceride, you're going to have a low HDL. So those things overlap substantially. Over here on the right is metabolic syndrome, which is really also correlated with obesity. And so there is a correlation, and it's statistically quite significant. But it's less important than the other things we're going to talk about. So let's talk about adipose tissue, because when I'm talking about fat, you have to understand that there are different forms of adipose tissue, and these are different with regards to your personal risk for having a cardiovascular event. So here's the depiction of different forms of adipose tissue. And although these all have the same lineage in terms of embryologic lineage of fat cells, they differentiate into different ways and have different implications with regards to your personal likelihood of an event. Adipose tissue is widespread throughout the body. We tend to think of, most of you think of, for example, whoops, let me go back here. Most of you think of things like subcutaneous tissue. You know, that's the pinch and inch, right, around your arm, around your belly, et cetera. There's adipose tissue in the bone marrow. There is actually adipose tissue that's important, that is both within the heart, but more importantly, around the heart. Your heart does have fat cells potentially. They're more prevalent in diabetics, and one of the reasons that diabetics have diabetic heart disease is because they have fat within the heart. But more importantly is fat that's deposited around the heart. Recent evidence tells us that that fat exudes substances that permeate into the heart and alter the heart's function and performance, including the development of coronary artery disease, for example. The most important fat from a cardiovascular risk, however, is visceral fat. Visceral fat, that's why I measure belly circumference, because it's a surrogate for visceral fat, and it's way more important than measuring somebody's arm fat, for example. Also, there are different forms of fat. And one of the things that has emerged as a very important concept is this concept of brown fat. So what do we mean by brown fat? Well, it turns out that in white fat, that's the fat that most of us think about as fat. When you buy a prime beef at the supermarket or something and you cut into it, the fat that's in there is this kind of fat. And the fat in a lean person, In a lean person might be okay, but in an obese person, these fat cells are biologically very active and exude all sorts of hormones that disrupt the body's function. As an example, these increase inflammation. It's why obese people are more likely to have an elevated C-reactive protein and other markers. It increases blood pressure. It alters the sensitivity to insulin. So these aren't just deposits of fat. These are biologically relevant organs, in this case adipose tissue, that affect all sorts of body functions, right? So dysfunctional tissue listed here has all these different signals that then go to the body and increase the likelihood of orthopedic issues. Why is it that when somebody gets a GLP-1 receptor agonist like Ozempic, that they have a great reduction in knee pain, right? Somebody who's referred to an orthopedic surgeon to get knee replacement, if you put them on a GLP-1 receptor agonist, half the people improve their osteoarthritis, may not even need a knee replacement. Why is that? It's because these things exude inflammatory, pro-inflammatory substances that make the knee more inflamed and make the knee hurt more. And it may be that something as simple as giving Ozempic, it's not just that somebody loses weight, but you turn down the inflammation, you improve osteoarthritis. It increases stroke rate, MI rate, peripheral arterial disease rate. And these aren't just due to the person's weighing more, right? You could put a backpack on somebody and they would weigh more, but it wouldn't have the same influence as having adiposity, particularly adiposity in the belly. Now, I mentioned a moment ago brown fat. So let me tell you the difference between brown fat and white fat, because this may be a wave in the very near future that will dramatically alter our health. So brown fat is considered the body's furnace. It's where fat cells actually burn lipids to generate heat. Okay? So it's a biologically active, not inflammatory type of fat, but it's one of the ways that we maintain body temperature, right? Because most of us don't live in a 97 or 98 degree environment, so we have to generate heat to be able to maintain our body heat. And that is in fact where body heat is one of the places where body heat is generated. Now, white fat, on the other hand, is the kind of fat that you don't like. It's the fat that is in your arms, in your belly, and as I mentioned, around the heart and other places. For the most part, we used to think of this as a fuel depot. It's where calories are stored for future use. However, in certain parts of the body, this is where I mentioned already that the fat can promote inflammation, insulin resistance, and disease, including high blood pressure, diabetes, etc. Right? So this is a noxious kind of fat. And it's considered pro-inflammatory in two particular beds circled here in green. The epicardial and pericardial fat is measurable using cardiac MRI and other things, but for the most part, that's a harder thing to measure. It's pretty darn easy to measure visceral fat. I pull out my tape measure and I measure somebody's belly, right? It takes 10 seconds. It gives you twice as much information as measuring a blood pressure, which actually takes longer to measure. And it's highly reproducible, very easy, and I would argue very motivating, right? I call it when I put my tape measure on somebody and then I say, what is your speedo weight? Most people, the speedo weight is below what their current weight is. Now, if you just use that single metric of waist circumference, so let's look at waist circumference in women. Left to right is BMI, the traditional metric, and in fact still the metric that must be met to meet certain criteria for the GLP-1 receptor shots, like Ozempic or Mounjaro, Zepbound, et cetera. So is there a connection between BMI and risk of cardiac events? So here's the relative value, the relative likelihood of dying of a cardiovascular event versus BMI. So 25 to more than 30, right? Normal versus obese. And yes, there's clearly a connection. If your BMI is high, you're more likely to die of a cardiovascular event. But look at people that have waist circumferences, and this is just a line in the sand. Women who are more than 35 inches versus less than 35 inches. It's actually a continuum, I'll show you. But if you just use that as a dichotomy here, look at the increased value. I don't care if your BMI is 25 and you're considered slender. If you have a fat belly, you're 3 times more likely to have a cardiovascular death if you're a woman, and that's way more information than if your BMI is 30 or greater. So just the simple measurement gives you 2 to 3 times more information than using your height and your weight on the scale, because it's the belly fat that's the bad fat. Women tend to put fat in the normal situation in hips and thighs, totally benign fat, nothing to do with hypertension, diabetes, etc. Belly fat, on the other hand, is noxious, and the scale cannot distinguish those two differences. This is true in men as well. So here's waist circumference in centimeters, but you can see that the likelihood here of dying, and it doesn't matter whether you're a smoker or you're a non-smoker, it makes no difference. This is a very steep curve, and measuring circumference of the abdomen gives you way more information. This is a steeper curve than with high blood pressure, for example. And at least at lower levels of cholesterol, it's more relevant than cholesterol, because it's a surrogate for lots of other things that go on in the body. And indeed, if you put these pieces of information together, here's what you get. To the left here are people who are considered by a BMI to be ideal weight, BMI less than 25. But even if you're in that category, if your waist circumference is high, these are the different waist circumferences, look at the gradient here. Yes, your BMI is normal, but you have a fat belly, you're twice as likely to have a cardiovascular death. This is actually death. Overweight, obese, same thing. You can be obese, but if your according to BMI, but if your belly circumference is normal, you don't have an increased risk. And this is why we shouldn't be using BMI. We shouldn't be using it. It takes no time and no money to measure belly circumference. It's just a way better marker. And this is true in multivariate analysis. Doesn't matter what your age is, whether, as I said, whether you've smoked. The prospective data are so compelling in this that we really should just take the fact that belly fat is the enemy. Okay? So if belly fat is the enemy, let's just lose weight. Seems like an easy thing. But why is it so difficult to lose weight and to maintain weight loss? Well, it turns out the answer is in epigenetics. Okay? All of us have had the experience that, why are there 5,000 diets out there? Because none of them work, right? I mean, they all work for a little bit, and then they don't work again. So there has to be something about biology. And it turns out it's sort of in your genes, but not in the blueprint of the genes. It's not in the genetic code. It's in how the genetic code is expressed, right? And this is due to what's called molecular scars from here I wrote epigenetics. We'll discuss what that is in a minute. But there is this concept of obesogenic memory that has been conclusively shown in an article a few months ago. And what that means is that when you get fat, signals change the expression in certain cells of your genetic code. And then when you lose weight, turns out those changes don't disappear. They remain. And that's why I use the term scar, because you gain weight, epigenetics changes, you lose the weight, but the epigenetic changes don't go away. And that has been shown to be the case in animals and in people, and I'll show you the data. And this is because of changes in RNA. Now, what Aura didn't tell you is, you have 3 billion base codes in your genetic code, and somewhere around 20,000 genes. We're not even sure exactly how many genes we have, because there's discussion about what in the heck is a gene. Most of your genetic code isn't expressed as a protein, but all that, it used to be called junk DNA and RNA and stuff, turns out is biologically incredibly relevant, including in this particular field. So let's look at the evidence of that. So what is epigenetics? You saw with Dr. Gordon's slide that it's a change. It doesn't change the blueprint. The DNA is your blueprint. But remember, if you give blueprints to a builder, your house can look different depending on the appointments and various things. And so the blueprint is fixed, but how it is expressed is not fixed. And it's alterable. And it's usually alterable by these environmental factors, some of which are reversible and some of which linger and may be lingering for your entire life. These changes include various chemical modifications of DNA and RNA, including some of them are listed here. These are not all of them. There's more and more attention to RNA's influence in this. So we always used to be DNA focused, and now it looks like RNA is a bigger player than people used to think. So let's look at evidence to support what I just stated. So here's an important study. in which they took people that had bariatric surgery. Okay, now, when you think about it, if you take somebody who's clearly obese, as depicted by this person here, this is a relatively small study, but these are people who underwent bariatric surgery, either a Roux-en-Y gastric bypass surgery or a sleeve, didn't matter. They all lost weight. In fact, they lost a dramatic amount of weight. And then they were followed for the next 2 years. Now, over here before the surgery, and 2 years later after they lost weight, and this was done in Europe in multiple different countries, they actually looked at the expression of these various components in fat cells and other cells to see, okay, fat people have different expression, but once they become thin again, does the expression of the genes go back to normal, or does it still look like a fat person's expression even though they are no longer obese? And it turns out that they lost a lot of weight. I'll just tell you, some of them went from a BMI of 45 down to 25, et cetera. But let me show you this. I don't expect you to know what this is. These are the way that these things are expressed. And boy, when you look at the stuff that Dr. Gordon reads every day, it's mind-boggling to those of us who are clinicians, because there are all sorts of schematics. I mean, what the heck is this? But what I'll tell you is that the orange, okay, are things that changed in a cell that 2 years later are still present, even though the person lost weight. So the genetic expression is changed by obesity, you make the person non-obese, and the changes persist 2 years later, even though the weight is now back to normal. And they did this complicated assessment of looking at all sorts of different cells, at the RNA expression of all these different cells, and they came up with these incredible things, that many of the regulations, either orange, or they can upregulate, downregulate. If you had breakfast this morning, turns out you upregulated 3,000 genes and downregulated 3,000 genes in the first hour after eating. She mentioned proteomics. One of the problems with that is, depending on whether you did it before the meal, an hour later, or 2 hours later, you get a totally different proteomic assessment, because genes are constantly being turned on and off and on and off. But it turned out that these regulations persist for years after you've lost weight. That's the epigenetic memory. And in these trials, they said, that's interesting. So they went on to do it in animals. And what they showed was that even though the people lost weight, or in this case, the animals lost weight, they regained it very quickly, because there was epigenetic memory that told the cells, feed me, feed me. So your fat cells, it's like that science fiction movie where, you know, the plants say, feed me, feed me. That's what happens. Your fat cells, even though they're still there, they're diminished in size, they say, feed me. And that's why it's so hard to lose weight. Okay, this was shown in mice. So in this case, they didn't do surgery. They took mice and they force-fed the mice to make them fat. And then they put them back on a lean diet, and all the mice got back down to normal weight. So in this case, orange was a normal mouse. Here, the mice were fat. They went down. And then they genotyped and did epigenetic RNA testing on the mice that had never been fat versus the fat ones who are now skinny again. And what they found, just like I was mentioning before, using these complicated genetic maps, is that a lot of the cells never returned to normal once the mice had gotten fat. And it's not just fat cells. Turns out these cells here are your endothelial cells. These are the cells that line your blood vessels. So once the mouse got fat, even though they got skinny again, there was permanent change in the endothelial cells. That's where plaque develops, or cholesterol deposits in arteries, right? That's the genesis of being an interventional cardiologist who has to open up arteries well. And the reason that the arteries need to be open is because they have plaque from cholesterol deposits. These were inflamed endothelial cells that persisted 2 years after the mice were skinny. And inflammatory cells, that's what these are. These are macrophages. So inflammatory cells and endothelial cells are changed by being fat, and those changes don't go away. That's what's depicted here. Your blood vessels and your inflammatory cells. So what this showed us, both in humans and in mice, is that once you get fat, the genetic expression is altered, as demonstrated by these RNA profiles, and that persists, whether it's surgical weight loss or diet weight loss, at least for the next 2 years. We don't know whether it exists for 20 years because we didn't have the technology 20 years ago to determine this, but 2 years is a long time. And that's why it's so hard to lose weight and maintain it. You can lose it, but why do you need to continue to take a GLP-1 receptor agonist or stay on your diet? It's because these fat cells will constantly prompt your brain to eat more, alter the metabolism, because they're looking after themselves. They're not looking after you. These changes were not limited to fat cells, but were present in blood vessels and inflammatory cells. And as I said, the feed me concept is there. Right? Now, maybe, though, there's a solution to this. And the solution resides in brown fat. Okay? So what is brown fat? Well, babies don't shiver. So to maintain their body heat, they need to burn more calories. And they burn the calories in the natural furnace called brown fat. Brown fat is in the core of the body, as depicted in this infant. It's around the spine and the scapula and the clavicles and the sort of the center part of the core part of the body. And babies will burn that so that they can generate heat. You and I, when we get hypothermic shiver, babies don't have the ability to do that. So some people had the bright idea, well, brown fat and white fat come from the same embryologic tissue. Maybe we can manipulate how a fat cell becomes a brown fat to burn calories, or white fat to become a noxious endocrine organ that says, feed me, and makes people fat. So let's explore that a little bit. Turns out heat is generated by brown fat through the beta receptor. And you all know the beta receptor because that's where beta blockers work. So it's one of the ways the heart speeds up, right? When you get excited or you have a fever or you're running, these beta receptors are stimulated by catecholamines and it makes the heart speed up. Well, it turns out that's how brown fat cells burn fat also. And brown fat cells are laden with beta receptors. Okay? Those of you who've ever given a beta blocker chronically, if you look closely at patients' weight, turns out beta blockers increase body weight in every study. So in heart failure trials and angina, when you give people chronic beta blockers, the weight goes up. The reason is not because they're altering their diet, it's because you're altering burning of fat through these fat cells. So people said, let's delve into the brown fat cell and see how there's regulation of the beta receptor. And it turns out the regulation is through, as listed on the right, this particular molecular entity that regulates how many beta receptors are on fat cells. And if there are more beta receptors on fat cells, the fat cell will burn more fat and you'll burn up calories. Okay? So beta blockers increase weight, beta stimulation lowers weight, but if you manipulate inside the cell, maybe we can do that without causing tachycardia and all the other things. So they did some experiments to try to show this. Now these are experiments in animals, but what they have shown, and this is just from a few months ago, is you can take a white fat cell, that's the normal fat you despise, and if you manipulate the internal milieu of that white fat cell, you can turn it into a fat-burning brown fat. Actually, because it used to be white, turning into brown, they call it beige fat. That's actually what they call it. Okay? So you want to manipulate it. Can you do that? Well, first, if you look at in the orange here, in brown fat, this is the number of beta receptors. It turns out they have 3 times the number of beta receptors. Now, those of you who are molecular people know that if you have 3 times more receptors on a cell, that's a lot. Any of you who are on Repatha or Praluent or inclisiran, which is Leqvio, the reason that your cholesterol goes down is because you triple the number of LDL receptors on a hepatocyte when you give those medicines. So normally, receptors like the beta receptor are very, very closely modulated, and tripling is a huge increase. So the reason beta receptors are 3 times more likely to be expressed in a brown fat cell, that's how the brown fat cells burn off calories. And so people had this brilliant idea that maybe if we could turn on beta receptors in white fat cells, we could convert noxious fat into fat that burns calories. And actually just flipping that switch, instead of getting fatter, you'd actually burn away your fat by dispensing it as heat. And this experiment showed that they could do this in mice. Okay? Hasn't been tried yet in people. But what they did was they figured out, okay, there are 3 times more beta receptors on brown fat cells. That's under the influence of this particular substance that I mentioned. This is the regulatory mechanism that makes the embryologic fat cell become a white or a brown fat cell, using this Kruppel-like zinc finger. For the biochemists in the audience, you'll understand what I'm talking about. But when they did that to animals, it turns out that they started burning more fat. The energy expenditure at rest went up. All my fat patients say, can't you just give me thyroid hormone and make me burn calories? My metabolism is off. Well, they actually were kind of right about that. You don't give thyroid, it doesn't work to lower weight. But this might be a way to do it. Because if I tripled your burning of calories at rest, think about that. You could eat the same number of calories, you'd lose weight like crazy. And that's what these mice did. Okay? Turns out that they were able to burn more calories, and all they did was manipulate white cells that are becoming beige fat cells and burning up the calories that were there. And these series of experiments were also done in human cells and showed that they could do the same thing. So maybe there is, in fact, an answer. And the answer might be as simple as, let's turn bad white tissue into good brown fat. Because as we age, the brown fat that we had as a baby tends to dissipate. But maybe we can flip that switch and actually make the brown fat, which is the good fat, be around. Or at least we can convert it into beige fat, which is better than white fat, maybe not as good as a baby brown fat. And such a change would burn calories and would lead to weight loss and less inflammation, because the white fat cells send out all these pro-inflammatory things, which brown fat cells don't do. So this, I think, is going to be the wave of the future, that we're going to figure out ways to convert bad fat into good fat. And this will alter this feedback loop where genetic expression causes your fat cells to tell you to eat more because they're only looking out for themselves. The best answer would be never to have fat in the first place, because if you don't get fat in the first place, you won't have the epigenetic changes that lead to this tailspin, and maybe emerging answers will be able to accomplish that, and I thank you for your attention.
All righty, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Wright, for that enlightening lecture. Before we go to break, so you can stretch your legs, I would like to remind everyone to please go and grab your raffle tickets and take a moment to reflect on what the Women's Heart Symposium and Have a Heart, Save a Heart's mission here mean to you and the future of women everywhere. For those of you who've not yet to meet me, I'm Jonathan Joseph, the newly minted Executive Director of Have a Heart, Save a Heart. I have been so privileged to be entrusted with this vital mission by our wonderful founders. And I want to thank each and every one of you here today for watching online, for joining us in person, and for supporting this amazing organization. I have worked with nonprofits since I was only 14 years old as a speaker for the Anti-Defamation League. And in that time, I've met so many amazing leaders and change makers in the medical and social impact fields. But I have never seen more genuine and inspiring groups leading through philanthropy as the women of Have a Heart, Save a Heart, and the Pacific Heart Institute's doctors. To the audience, both online and here, I want to extend myself to each and every one of you as a resource and a partner in this vital fight to save the lives of women everywhere. I don't have to reiterate to this audience in particular the gravity of the American Heart Association's latest figures showing a backslide into increasing levels of CVD mortality. Until less than 1/3 of women in the United States are at risk from death from cardiovascular disease, our work is not done. I have been brought here to expand our programming, to meet the needs of all women everywhere, while continuing to honor the history rooted in the professional thought leadership that we see here today, and have seen for 11 Women's Heart Symposia before. Over the next year, we'll be debuting our plans for an annual fund, increased major giving opportunities, new events and awareness campaigns, alongside patient-centered resources to save lives, empower women, and make the process of teaching your patients a little easier on the providers in the room. For those of you here in person, you will see a pledge card in your gift bags. Please consider making a contribution that will enable us to grow this organization, especially at a time when the data demonstrates a need bigger than ever. If you are viewing online, just scan the QR code on screen to set up a one-time or recurring donation. Now, thank you all for coming here today and ensuring that this symposium was not another victim of these tragic fires.
We are thrilled to continue the genetics conversation with our next special guest. Dr. Josh Ofman is a true visionary who created the company Grail after spending 15 years at Amgen. Not only does he hold many degrees from UCLA, Cedars, and Cal Berkeley, but he also serves as chairman of the board of directors of Everyone Medicines, a company dedicated to precision medicine for rare genetic diseases. Over the past few years, many of you have probably asked your doctors to order the Gallery test and never thought you would meet the doctor behind the test. Please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Josh Ofman.
Well, hello, it's great to be here, and thank you for that warm introduction. So today what we're going to talk about is a little bit different. It's about early cancer detection and why it's so important, and the new genomic technologies that you've already heard about from Dr. Gordon and Dr. Wright about how we can deploy those technologies to find a lot more cancer in the population. So, as most of you know, cancer is soon to become the #1 killer of men and women worldwide. It's one of those diseases that is quite feared and one that creates a lot of anxiety in people, which is why we try to screen asymptomatic adults for cancer. But you can see the toll, the human toll that cancer takes in the population. Now today you may be saying, well, Josh, I get screened for cancer. Who gets their colonoscopy for colon cancer screening? Who gets their mammogram for breast cancer screening? I'll just tell you a little story. When I got my colonoscopy, and I happen to be a gastroenterologist, at that moment, I felt really good about myself. I'm being proactive, I'm screening myself for colon cancer, but that very day, I was 10 times more likely to be diagnosed and killed by a different cancer than the one I was looking for, okay? And that's the sad truth about all of this. We screen today for 5 cancers, 3 in women, breast, cervical, and colon, 2 in men, colon and prostate, and then if you happen to be a heavy smoker, also we screen for lung cancer, okay? That's it. And when you look at all of those screening tests together, they're only finding about 14% of the cancers in the population. That's it. What about the other cancers that we're not looking for? So we're not going to bend the mortality curve in cancer by screening for cancers that only represent, or we only find about 14% of all the cancers. So how can we do much better than that? Again, if you think about those cancers, breast, colon, they're the most common cancers. But 80% of all the cancer deaths are from cancers we are not screening for at all. Okay? That's the big problem. And these are facts that most oncologists do not know and only come from looking at the epidemiology of cancer very carefully. Most doctors are not aware of this, that the vast majority of cancer deaths are occurring from the cancers we are not screening for at all. Each one of them alone represents a very small number, but when added up together, they vastly outpace the cancers that we are screening for. So again, 86% of those diagnosed are unscreened. In other words, the 14% are the ones we're finding through screening. And again, if you can find cancer early, in early stages before it has spread, you have a 4 to 5 times higher survival rate. So early cancer detection, stage 1, stage 2, and some stage 3, before they've widely metastasized, are treatable and often curable cancers. I often get asked, hey, Josh, I got this question at the FDA. Josh, do we even have treatments for those early stage cancers like early pancreatic, early ovarian, early The answer is, of course we do. They're surgical. Surgery and radiation. Almost every solid tumor, with the exception of prostate and thyroid, where you may watch and wait, have definitive curative intent procedures and surgeries for solid tumors, almost every one of them. And that's often, again, something people don't recognize. So we can have an amazing impact through early cancer detection, more treatment options, often with curative intent, and much longer survival if you can find cancer in its early stage. And when it's early, you're often asymptomatic. So the goal here is, how do we do asymptomatic screening for the vast majority of cancers? Now, who's at risk for cancer? So it turns out the most obvious, the most strong, the most compelling risk factor is age. Turns out that when you look at the absolute risk of cancer of a 50-year-old, it's about 0.4%. That's a bigger incidence than many other common diseases that we screen for today. Now, if you're over the age of 50, as opposed to under the age of 50, you're at about a 13 times higher risk of developing cancer. So age is by far the most important risk factor for cancer. And we've pegged high risk or elevated risk at age 50 because that 0.4% is a big number relative to other things. Now, there are lots of other ways of aging yourself into the risk of a 50-year-old. If you're a 35-year-old smoker, you can age yourself into that 50-year-old risk. If you're a 35-year-old cancer survivor, okay, so there are a lot of people who've survived breast cancer, survived other cancers, childhood cancers, adolescent cancers, you age yourself into that risk. If you have a very strong family history, as you already heard, if you're obese, that is a risk factor for cancer. You've got toxic exposures or hereditary syndrome, as you heard from Dr. Gordon. Those all provide that elevated risk for cancer. So my contention is that when you are at elevated risk for cancer, either by age or other risk factors, you need to be looking broadly at whether you have cancer, not just screening for the 3 cancers we look for in women and the 2 in men, but we need to look for all the other cancers that are causing about 80% of all the cancer deaths. So we know there's a better way, and we have to change from only screening for individual cancers to screening for individuals, right? So we need to move away from this idea is we're going to look at your cervical cancer, we're going to look at his prostate cancer, to we're going to look at Bob for any cancer Bob may be harboring, because Bob happens to be at risk for the entire panoply of the incidence of cancers, not just his colon cancer and his prostate cancer. And we know that. And we have to stop looking at Sue for her breast cancer or her cervical cancer and look at Sue for any of the cancers that Sue may be at risk for, which is the full suite of cancers. And there are hundreds of different types of cancers. So this is the big paradigm change. This is the big idea about, can we fundamentally change clinical practice to move away from only screening for individual cancers to also screening an individual for whatever cancer they have. And we have the most important body fluid in the world to do that, blood. And now we have biomarkers to do that, DNA that is being shed into the blood from tumors. And now we have an actual biological signal directly from cancers that are circulating in people's bloods, and now we have all the tools to interrogate that signal. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that now. That makes sense? You with me? Okay, let's move on. So, in blood, it is the most powerful aggregator of biological signals in the body is your blood. everything gets into your blood. And it turns out that when tumors are growing in your body, most of them, not all of them, but most of them are shedding DNA into the blood. So if I looked at your blood, I would see a lot of DNA. And then the question is, how can I discriminate whether that DNA is being shed from a tumor or is just being shed from normal cells that are dying? And it turns out we can do that. And you've already heard about from Dr. Wright today and Dr. Gordon about epigenetics. The methylation is one way that DNA regulation is controlled. It turns genes on and off. It tells your cells when you're an embryo to become a kidney cell or a liver cell, and it changes over time. But it turns out that methylation can be measured, assessed in fragments of DNA, and that there's a very particular pattern that you see when that DNA is aberrantly or abnormally methylated in cancer. And it's very common in cancer, and you almost never see that in people without cancer. So we have identified a signal that is very specific. In other words, you almost never see it in normal people, and you always see it in cancer. And by the way, you see it across cancer types. It's not specific to an individual cancer. And we compared all the signals in genomics. We looked at mutations, changing the code of the DNA. We looked at chromosomal abnormalities. We looked at proteins. We looked at RNA. And we looked at a combination of them. We looked at different histone modifications. And then we looked at methylation pattern recognition. And what we found here is that methylation pattern recognition was by far the most powerful signal in the genome that we could see that could detect cancer, okay? And the beauty of this signal, that is abnormally methylated fragments of DNA, is that you get two pieces of information. The first piece of information is, boy, that looks abnormal, and it's probably coming from a cancer. And second, there's a fingerprint about where the origin of that signal comes from. Because when you're an embryo, it's the methylation markers that are telling cells to become a brain cell or a liver cell or a kidney cell. So we can find that signature as well. So we can say there's a cancer signal in your blood, and it's coming from your pancreas or from your stomach or from your ovary or from your head and neck area. So that's the power of this genomic signal. So the way this assay works is you draw someone's blood, you sequence the DNA in the blood. First you amplify the DNA, then you sequence it using bisulfite sequencing, which gives you a methylation pattern. And then we've developed machine learning classifiers. This is a form of artificial intelligence where we have machine learning doing pattern recognition to classify the signal as a cancer signal or a non-cancer signal. And then if it's a cancer signal, it gives you the predicted origin. So it's a very simple test report. It says cancer signal detected, predicted origin ovary, and then the doctor knows what to go do to go find that cancer. And the predictions are highly, highly accurate. I'll show you that in a moment. So it's not one of those things where you go on a wild goose chase. You get a very focused diagnostic evaluation. The cancer can then be found or not found, and then we can move on. But it's an unbelievably powerful tool because this signal is shared by somewhere between 50 and 70 different types of cancer. And we're still grouping cancer types. Like we know breast cancer is 5 different types of cancer, lung cancer is at least 4 different types, and we're still calling them just one. So we have a work to do to unravel all the different subtypes, but we know that we can find over 50 or 70 different types of cancer. So it's a simple blood test. We draw 2 tubes of blood. Has anybody here taken the Gallery blood test? Okay, so there are a few people who've taken it. So it's a very simple process. You get 2 tubes of blood drawn. It gets shipped to our CAP-CLIA certified lab in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. It takes about 7 to 10 days to return a result. This test has a very low false positive rate. So let me remind everybody, what are the worries that people have about screening tests? The first is false positive rates, right? So they're false positives, you get a diagnostic test, it can cause harm, that's a risk. The second risk people are worried about is obviously false negatives. We've missed a cancer. These are ubiquitous. Every cancer screening test has these problems. And then the third risk is obviously if you get a negative result, that you'll stop doing your screening that you need to be doing, and that's a risk we can prevent. But if you think about what we do today, and we call it single cancer screening, okay? A mammogram, a colonoscopy, or a Cologuard blood test, stool test, or a low-dose CT of the lungs. Those tend to have false positive rates above 10%. Mammogram is about 12%, low-dose CT of the lung is about 14%, false positive rates. The false positive rate for the Gallery blood test, which looks for over 50 different types of cancer, is 0.5%. Because we aren't looking, this isn't images, we're not looking at shadows, we're not trying to directly visualize tissue, we're actually reading a biological signal directly from a cancer. And that provides the opportunity to be much, much more specific. So simple blood test, incredibly low false positive rate, an order of magnitude lower than any other single cancer screening test. It predicts where in the body it is, and we have very good detection rates for aggressive cancers. Here's what we know biologically. The more aggressive a cancer is, the more invasive it is, the more DNA it is shedding. And that's what we're measuring. We're measuring DNA that is shed right from the tumor. There are slow-growing tumors like encapsulated prostate cancers in men that people are worried we're overdiagnosing. They're very slow-growing. Guess what? They're not shedding very much DNA into the blood. Hormone-positive breast cancer compared to triple-negative breast cancer, much more aggressive. Compared to interval breast cancer, is much more deadly. Hormone-positive breast cancers shed much less DNA into the blood. So our detection of those cancers that we're worried about, that we're overdiagnosing, is not as good as the detection of pancreatic cancer, ovarian cancer, gastric cancer, the invasive, aggressive cancers. Even the bad prostate cancers, the rapidly growing ones that occur in young people, we find very well because they're shedding lots of DNA into the blood. And this test report here is on the screen, very simple. It's not like the mutation test where you get 20 pages of 200 mutations. This is completely different. Cancer signal detected, yes or no? If yes, here's where to go look. It's that straightforward. So here are some of the numbers. Among the aggressive cancers, and we've categorized and pre-specified a group of 12 cancers that account for about 2/3 of cancer deaths in the United States, we find those in early stages over 70% of the time. Again, the false positive rate, and these are done in large, large studies, the largest studies ever done in human genomic medicine. 0.5% false positive rate compared to 13% for lung cancer screening or 14% for stool-based colon cancer screening. The positive predictive value is the most important metric. Let me remind everybody what that is. The positive predictive value means that if you have a positive test result, what is the likelihood that you have cancer? And over a series of studies that we've done, our results are somewhere between 40 and 50%. Okay? That means if you got a Gallery blood test, you're almost, it's a 1 in 2 chance that I'm sitting in front of you right now and that you have cancer. This isn't telling you about your risk of developing cancer. It's telling you right now you likely have cancer. Let me put that number into context. If you had a positive mammogram tomorrow, the likelihood that you have breast cancer is 5%. If you had a positive low-dose CT scan of the lung because you're a smoker, the likelihood in a positive low-dose CT that you have lung cancer is about 6%. So we're about an order of magnitude higher in our positive predictive value, which is the most important. If you're a doctor, you don't know if a patient in front of you has cancer or not. Sensitivity and specificity mean you know their actual status. Positive predictive value and negative predictive value are the numbers that matter when you don't know what the status of the patient is in front of you. So clinically, it's the positive predictive value that matters, right? And I'm sure most of the clinicians here understand that difference. And then again, how accurate are we when we tell you the predicted location is the stomach or the ovary? It's about somewhere between 85 and 90%, depending on which study. And that's really good because most of the cancers are found right away. Now, there's about 10% of cases where that prediction might be wrong, and it can get confused, our machine learning algorithm, by things like HPV, human papillomavirus-related cancers. Those can occur in the head and neck, they can occur in the cervix, they can occur in the anus. Hepatobiliary cancers can occur in the pancreas, in the biliary tree, and the liver. So we can be off sometimes because of those confusing biological signals. But there's a very easy way to fix that. If you look for the cancer and don't find it, you can get a free repeat test right away to see whether it's a false positive. But we've studied the ones that come back positive, and they all have cancer. So if you get a repeat blood test and it's positive again, that patient's got a cancer, and you better go looking for it. And you should ask the patient again, where else could we be looking? Because this test should be done in people without symptoms, right? Asymptomatic cancer screening. So again, we did a big study in 6,600 adults in the United States across centers. And what did we find? These were asymptomatic adults over the age of 50. And we found that when you added Gallery to single cancer screening, we more than doubled the number of cancers we found in the population. Almost half of them were diagnosed in early stages, and over 70% of them were cancers that we don't typically screen for. Now, we found more colon cancers, we found more breast cancers because not everybody gets that screening, and they come up in the intervals, but most of the cancers we found were unscreened cancers, deadly cancers, ovarian, gastric, and esophageal, pancreatic, head and neck. We found all those different types of cancers. We also find a lot of hematologic malignancies because you can imagine in blood, there's a very strong signal of shed DNA. So we found a lot of myelomas, we found leukemias, we found a lot of chronic myelogenous leukemias, CMLs, and MDS. We found lots of hematologic cancers. Again, we've done this test now in hundreds of thousands of people in the real world. And what's been very reassuring is we're finding results very similar to what we saw in our studies. The big, huge trials, 150,000 people randomized, those are going to read out at the end of the year. Okay, so we've got some big, large trials, but these are also very large experiences. So hundreds of thousands of adults. What we're finding is that about 1% of the population has a positive result, which is kind of what you'd expect. There's about a 1% incidence of cancer, right, in the population. These are in adults over the age of 50, and about half of those we end up diagnosing cancer. So we're finding a lot more cancer in the population. So this could have a huge public health impact. And we're very accurate around, in the real world so far, around where we're finding it. And then again, 99% are having a no cancer signal detected. So in most of the people who take the test, it can be reassuring that we didn't find a cancer signal, but it's never perfectly reassuring because not all cancers shed a lot of DNA into the blood, and cancers can be missed. So, we don't find every cancer, so that's a disclaimer for any screening test. There will be false positives, there will be false negatives, but nothing has ever been shown to have accuracy quite like this to date. So it really is groundbreaking in many respects. In the real world, you can see, look at all the different kinds of cancers that we are finding. And some of the deadliest, most important cancers, ovarian, esophageal, a lot of liver cancer. We're finding early pancreatic cancers. We found a stage 1 pancreatic cancer at UCSF, and the surgeon says, I've actually never seen that before. We're finding cancer so early that doctors are telling us they've never seen it in early gastric cancer in the United States like that. They just don't see it. And so we're getting people being treated with curative intent. On our website, there's lots of testimonials from patients that tell these heart-wrenching stories about, what they went through, but they were asymptomatic and they had a positive signal. And you can look at the journey that they went through, and they've had, often cases, curative intent surgery. And so these are very unusual. It really is quite paradigm changing. So I just want to, illustrate to you that this isn't being done, with smoke and mirrors. Our company, Grail, was spun out of Illumina, which is the biggest DNA sequencing company in the world. And the idea happened, just as this anecdote, they were studying pregnant women. They were studying 125,000 pregnant women to see if they could use DNA in the mother, because the fetus shares blood with the mother, instead of doing amniocentesis. Has anybody had an amniocentesis? That's what you do with pregnant women, or used to do, to find out if there was a chromosomal abnormality in the fetus. But it's dangerous. It can abort the fetus in about 1% of cases. So Illumina wanted to see, we could probably look at the DNA in the blood of the mother and find the fetal DNA and do it that way, much safer. And in the course of that study, they found 10 women whose DNA looked so abnormal that they called them all back because of abnormal methylation. Called them all back, and all 10 of them had a cancer in the body, asymptomatic, and they were diagnosed with cancer. And that's when the light bulbs went off in Illumina that, hey, we may have just found a way of diagnosing asymptomatic cancer in adults, and they spun out Grail to develop that technology. In the process of doing that, we've done the largest clinical genomics program ever conceived of and ever executed, with hundreds of thousands of people that we've now studied to validate this amazing technology. And there are many companies out there now working on technology like this for cancer detection, which is a good thing, okay? We just happen to have had an early start. In the NHS, the National Health System in England, and we partnered with them and the UK government to do this large trial. They sent buses all over the country to collect data. It's 140,000 adults randomized, followed for 3 consecutive years of testing. That study was enrolled in 10 months. That would have taken 4 years to enroll in the United States, because the whole government got behind it and the whole country participated, and they have a single-payer healthcare system. So it's now completed. We're going to reveal those data in early 26, and that will be part of our big FDA package that we submit. Right now, the test is available, as most lab tests are, using a pathway that's been provided for diagnostic tests called the lab-developed test pathway. Most of the diagnostic tests we get today are not FDA approved. Some are, but we are going to get FDA approved, but it's available now in the market as a lab-developed test. And it's in use right now. This technology is being used by health systems across the country. I think Dr. Gordon mentioned Providence being a very early adopter, but health systems across the country, large self-insured employers are giving this test to their employees as a benefit. Life insurance companies are giving this test as a benefit, a wellness benefit to their policyholders, because their incentives are aligned. Life insurance companies would like you to live as long as you can, and know that early cancer detection is one way to achieve that. And then there are some payers, many other distribution partners. A lot of fire departments are giving this test to their firefighters because they're exposed to toxic chemicals. We're doing a big study in the VA where there's a lot of exposure to toxic chemicals like burn pits, and they're at risk for cancer, and so they're using Gallery to try to find it. The exciting part about this, and I think Dr. Wright and Dr. Gordon both mentioned this, is that these epigenetic marks, these epigenetic patterns, these methylation patterns, are also prevalent in many other diseases. So the exciting part of what Grail has developed is this technology that looks at methylation patterns and uses AI and machine learning to read them and classify them. That approach can also be used in cardiovascular disease, autoimmunity, and neurodegeneration. And if you think about the demographic tidal wave that we're all staring into, the aging of the population, what could bankrupt the healthcare system today is not too much spending on drugs or the price of this test or that test. It's the prevalence of disease. And these three diseases, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and Alzheimer's disease, could overwhelm the healthcare system. Not the price of drugs, not the price of tests, not the price of seeing your doctor. The prevalence of these diseases could take our healthcare system down. So we have to use every tool we have in our armamentarium now, and genomics is going to lead the way. And we can diagnose these diseases early when patients have a much better chance of being effectively managed and treated. That's the real exciting part of this type of technology. Dr. Gordon mentioned the Human Genome Project. That was completed in 2003. It cost $25 billion. Almost nothing has come from that at the population level yet, right? Until now. And I think that the GRAIL technology, the Gallery test for multi-cancer early detection in the population could be the first population-wide application of the Human Genome Project. And so with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the panel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ofman, for sharing insights from the cutting-edge work and such important work that your team is doing in the genetic testing space. We ask you to please stay closer to the stage as we gather the other morning speakers. So for the last portion of our morning agenda, we're inviting all of our speakers up to the stage for a panel Q&A to help answer some of your burning questions. While they're coming up, please remember to submit your questions either in the online chat or raise your hand and our volunteers will get the microphone to you. All right, so I'll start off with a question. Let's say I'm a patient and I'd like to get a genetic test done. Is the first step to maybe go online to one of these websites and order the test myself? Should I bring it up to my primary care doctor? Should I start looking for a life insurance plan first and then get the test? What sequence would you recommend?
So I think that getting information is definitely where you start, and I certainly would encourage that through a place where there's expertise, like my clinic and the genetic services. There is a lot to learn online, and I can say that because genetic counselors, I have a team of genetic counselors that work with me, is a scarce resource, and they're even scarcer to find medical geneticists. I learned yesterday that there apparently is one medical geneticist for every 500,000 people in the US.
Wow.
So, you know, it's a rare bird right here. But so there have been there are actually a lot of telehealth genetic services to help educate patients, to help pre-test, to help get out the information and help facilitate breaking down barriers. That's where I'd start. In terms of the life insurance issue, and I know I threw it out there and it kind of always makes people feel anxious. If you know that there's a mutation in your family, if you're at significantly high risk, it is something particularly for young people who may be self-employed and who are early on their journey, that we do always have them think about taking pause before they initiate testing and get that in place beforehand.
And maybe just one other comment. I think, as Dr. Gordon said, you do want to go somewhere where there is a lot of expertise. This is pretty complicated. There are a lot of consumer-oriented tests that share with you your risk and your predisposition of having certain conditions, but I still, even if you're going to do that online, make sure you find a physician that can help you. In our space, where I was thinking about multi-cancer early detection, there was a thought maybe 5 or 6 years ago, Dr. Gordon will remember, where that should be a consumer-directed test. And I just, that was not a good idea. I think that when you're talking to somebody about whether they have cancer right now, This needs to be done by a doctor, with their patient. And so, some of these technologies that are not about risk, but are actually about the presence or absence of disease, I think need to be handled, through your physician.
I actually want to ask Josh sort of a basic science question. So the entire predication of your concept is that cells are shedding DNA. Now, are normal cells shedding DNA, or are these cells that die? Just tell us, how does the DNA get from the cell into the circulation so you can pick it up?
Well, both ways, actually. Most of the DNA are coming from cells that are dying, but rapidly turning over cells, like in your skin and in some of your epithelial tissues, are also shedding DNA when they're rapidly turning over, but not as rapidly turning over as cancer. So there are certain marks in the DNA fragments that are shed from cancer that are very distinct from the methylation marks that are seen from normal, regular cells that are shed. So even regular cells are shedding DNA, but we can discriminate that from cancer cells that are shedding fragments of DNA.
My other question was, and I noticed in some of the things, I never imagined how many different forms of RNA there are. It's like mind-boggling, and it's so different than the Watson-Crick concept, et cetera. So as we're peering into the future, is the answer still going to be, in your estimation, DNA, or will exosomes and all these different RNA, et cetera, actually be as important or more important?
Yeah, it's a great question. We are constantly searching for analytes or other forms that are orthogonal, that are providing additional information to our methylation approach. And there's no doubt, I think Dr. Gordon would agree, we're going to find those. There's going to be certain proteins, maybe some forms of RNA, maybe other types of transcripts that can inform cancer detection. To date, nothing we've looked at provides additional information to the methylation signature. It's a very powerful signature. And so we haven't found anything yet that is additive to our finding. In other words, it didn't increase the sensitivity. But there's no doubt we're going to find it, and we're going to keep looking. And we think it's going to be not the usual suspect proteins, but probably some of the proteins that we're now in the proteomics field beginning to discover.
You quoted a 0.5% false positive rate. How do you define a false positive? I mean, let's say there's a methylation signal, but the tumor's too small for us to detect. That's not a false positive.
Well, it's a great point. So right now, the way we define false positive, so it was a 0.5% false positive rate. The definition of the false positive rate is among those individuals who are known not to have cancer. So you have to have.
How do you know they don't have cancer?
So there's only two ways to know that. One is through time, right? And so we at Grail in our studies have used time. So if somebody gets a test on day 1 and has not been diagnosed with a cancer on day 365, we call that a negative cancer status. That's one way of knowing it. There are questions about whether you need 2 years or 1 year, but I think the FDA has agreed 1 year is probably sufficient. The other way would be doing some whole body image. But unfortunately, whole body imaging is very imperfect and is not a great measure of what we call ground truth. So we do, the other way we do this is through case-controlled studies. So studies of people who are known at the time not to have cancer or to have cancer through one of those two techniques. And then we measure the sensitivity and specificity of our assay in those people.
But imaging can't pick up really small tumors. So part of my question is,
exactly right.
How big or how small does a tumor have to be before you can detect it in the serum?
So there's no, and I'll ask Dr. Gordon there's no, the mathematical models that were done 20 years ago to correlate DNA shedding to tumor size are wrong, and they're known to be wrong. And so we're learning a lot about cancer biology right now through this assay. We know that we can find tumors that are not visible on imaging. We've done it. We've seen pancreatic cancers that were not visible on imaging that were found on endoscopic ultrasounds. We find them all the time. We also know that people who are called a false positive, when we followed them for 6 more months, we found the cancer. So I can't give you a precise size, but I do know that they're smaller than often can be detected on imaging. And the problem most of us have is we've been taught that imaging is perfect. Imaging is far from perfect, and that's part of the problem that confounds all of this.
Yeah, I think then there's a question, so I want to open that, but I just wanted, so a couple of things just to be thinking about. So I've been the principal investigator for our GRAIL study, our Gallery study, and looking in high risk, hereditary high risk or strong family history high risk patients as a subset of those to see, is this a good addition? How do we do it? We're asking them to do a lot of imaging and correlate that. I was tested, I think over 2,000 patients now, so I have this very, very similar in terms of that experience, in terms of how many are positive and how do we follow that forward. It is a trigger point of anxiety for when both providers and patients to say, oh my gosh, 50% of the time when the test is positive, you don't find a cancer. So again, you have to kind of boil down those numbers and say, okay, only one, and in our studies too, it's been about just under 1% screen positive. There's a cancer signal detected result. And then of those, for us, it's been, a little over half that we find a cancer the first time we're looking at the source for where that is. And the repeat test, and I think that there'll be a lot of learning to say, when does that repeat test need to be done? We had kind of waited to the end of their workup in 4 months. It's clear that the sooner you get that repeat test, if that repeat test remains positive, that is a very strong indicator that there is cancer that we need to find. If that second test is negative, that maybe it was the picking up what was being picked up in that methylation signal is not a cancer. So those are all the things that go through in terms of discussion. It is the beginning of a tsunami in terms of this space. There is no question that blood-based screening for cancer is going to transform how we screen for cancer in the future. It's just going to be a question of kind of the who's and what's. Because if it's ultra high risk for pancreatic cancer, is a single blood-based test for pancreatic cancer, which may be using different analytes in that particular cancer, be the better test? A global test for somebody who's just looking at their total cancer risks may be the best test for somebody who doesn't have one specific elevation in cancer. All of those things are still part of what we're learning and going. And, I always say, either you got the iPhone 1 because you're an early adopter, or you're waiting for the 16, right? So people are different in how they decide to engage with new technology and feel that they can be part of that journey to learning and getting kind of understanding how to best use. But those are very strong, good questions. That it is a matter of the biology of dumping, that it's the correlation is really the aggressivity of the tumor or the specific kind of behavior of that cancer as opposed to a size burden. And
maybe just one thing to Dr. Wright's question. What's so interesting about DNA shedding, and this has all been published, and I think Dr. Gordon has helped us with this data, is that when you look at even late stage cancers that are not shedding a lot of DNA, their survival rates are much better than their counterpart cancer that is shedding a lot of DNA. So it turns out that whether cancers shed DNA is one of the most important predictors of cancer outcomes. Cancers that are shedding DNA have mortality curves that look just like what you would expect from the National SEER Cancer Registry. Cancers that are not shedding DNA, whatever the stage, have much better survival than would ever be predicted, which gives us a lot of confidence in the cancers that we're missing. In other words, if we're not detecting it, at least it's likely a cancer that's not shedding a huge amount of DNA into the blood. That makes us feel a little better, although it's not perfect.
This is a question for Dr. Ofman. Do you have a sense of what the frequency of the test would be, and do you have any idea of what the cost would be?
I have an idea of both. Right now, this is what we call the pre-reimbursement phase of the product. So there is some reimbursement. Some payers pay for it. Some life insurance companies, some self-insured employers are paying for it, but largely it's a self-pay out-of-pocket test. The retail price, if an individual walks in off the street, is about $949. For other large groups, the price is obviously discounted, and it can be found for less than that. I know at Providence, for example, it's less than that, and others, but it is an out-of-pocket test. But that's going to change. We're going to get this test FDA approved. We're going to get this test reimbursed. I have no question about that, and that will change the whole dynamic of how we can screen at scale the population. And we've built a lab that has the ability to run millions of tests, so we're all prepared for that. Your second question is, what should the interval be, right? Right now, based on everything we know about the biology of tumor progression, we think it should be done annually. Now, we may learn that there are higher risk people that should be screened more frequently than that, but right now we don't know that. So we think based on everything we've learned about DNA shedding, about the dwell time of cancer, in other words, how long does a cancer stay in any particular stage, and how fast they're moving, I can tell you we are finding that aggressive tumors are moving much faster through stages when you look at their DNA than when you look at imaging. And so we're kind of rewriting the textbooks of cancer biology through the development of this type of assay. And so annual, we think, is the best chance to find aggressive cancers at an earlier stage.
And Josh, do people age out? What is your current age criteria?
You know, right now it's just, we don't know the answer to your question, whether we should stop screening people at age 80, but right now we're recommending what most screening tests do, which is that you should, between age 50 and 79 is the right way to go.
Closer you get to 80, the farther away you want to move that, right? And as we live well, right? Because 80 is the new 60. And then the minimum age is 22, just based on validation. And then again, when you're thinking about a test like this, it's the risk you want to be thinking about, your underlying kind of where you are in your level of risk for cancer, because that's where the positive negative ratio and kind of the importance of the test outcome, the higher the likelihood that you could have cancer, the more predictive this test is going to be. So again, that's why sort of the 50 and above threshold is sort of a general age category, or something with a higher risk factor like history of smoking, otherwise exposures.
Well, Josh already showed us that the biggest predictor is age, right? So what's your hit rate for a 50-year-old versus a 70-year-old?
It's less. So our hit rate, for exactly a 50-year-old, I think is about somewhere around 0.5 or 6%. But if you look at the decade of 50 to 60, it's about 0.8 or 0.9, and then 60 to 70, I think it's like 1.3 to 1.5. So it goes up with age.
Yeah, so for
even over the age of
population
50.
economic basis, then screening 70-year-olds is more cost-effective, if you want to use that term.
Correct, but I can tell you this, that screening adults over the age of 50 is highly cost-effective relative to other screening tests that we do today. And so when you look at what cost-effectiveness means, it's kind of the value for money. So, if you spend X amount of money, how much health are you buying? And there's numbers that says this is good value, this is bad value. Even at the list price of our test today, screening adults over the age of 50 is very high value.
I wanted to ask Dr. Wright, how much of a weight gain are we talking about? Would a weight gain of, say, 30 pounds cause this detrimental expression in the white fat cells?
Yeah. So in general, for a normal-sized person, 1 inch of belly girth is about 7 pounds of weight. And in those trials, now obviously in the human trial that I showed you, people didn't undergo bariatric surgery unless they were pretty obese, right? So you saw their BMI. They didn't report belly circumference in that trial, but they went from a BMI of like 40 to a BMI of 25. And a BMI of 40, if you come into my office, most people that are that obese have a belly circumference of like 50 inches, way beyond what. So the belly circumference is linear with regards to risk, and there are different norms. The well-accepted norm is that for a Caucasian woman, the danger is at 35 inches of abdominal circumference at the maximal circumference. But the truth is that, 34 versus 35 versus 36. I mean, to have a binary, yes, no, is not really the way it should be looked at. The curves that show that it's linear all the way down into below 30 inches. So you really want to be the physique you were when you were college age, is the bottom line. And most of us probably are not any longer. So even, let's say, a 15-pound weight, which is over 2 inches of belly circumference, is meaningful.
And then I have a question for Dr. Ofman, and you can tell me if this is for a later presentation, but I was wondering, do the senescent or zombie cells in the pancreas shed DNA that might indicate, a cancer or not in cancer? Or?
Well, that's actually a very deep question, and maybe Dr. Gordon knows that. I know that the senescent cells that occur in organs contribute to cancer development. I can't tell you if the DNA that's being shed in pancreatic cancers are coming from those cells. Probably not, but I don't know that for sure. Do you know the answer to that question?
I don't know the answer.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because we now know that the senescent cells that are in these tissues are contributing to all kinds of problems, right? Inflammation, tumorigenesis. I just don't know whether the DNA is coming from those
And
specific
Josh,
cells.
a similar question, are there times when you shouldn't send the test? For example, if somebody is actively infected in pneumonia and stuff, do they have false positives at that time?
Yeah, absolutely. So, pregnancy obviously creates a big false positive. If you're actively being treated for cancer, that's not when you want to do this type of test. And if you do have cancer, you want to wait at least 3 years until your treatment is completed to begin screening again for all these other cancers. But we don't know enough about some of the things you mentioned, the time of day, should you do it right after exercise, not, and obviously if you have an infection or are acutely ill, that's not the time to get cancer screening. But there are some other things we need to learn as well.
Realizing that there is a pretty big expense and time factor to seeing a geneticist, wouldn't it seem a better idea to just go to your physician and say, I want to have this test done, hoping everything's negative, and fork out the $949?
Josh will say yes.
I think for if you're talking about the multi-cancer early detection test, certainly primary care providers, internists, specialists are doing these tests today. I don't think you need a genetic specialist for that type of cancer screening. But I think the types of tests that Dr. Gordon was talking about earlier, I think for those types of tests, that seems much more important to make sure you're in contact with someone who really understands human genetics.
So there are a lot of providers who have gotten super comfortable, GYN, in primary care, that this becomes an interest, gastroenterology, and they do their risk testing in their own office and then will send if they're positive or if there's some uncertainty. I always want to make sure that I reinforce two things. One is that in family history, paternal family history matters. So I know this is our women's heart, but you guys as the arbiters of care for your families, people ignore paternal family histories when it comes to thinking about women's cancers, and that's totally untrue because it's carried the same by men and women. It just presents the cancers, the tissue presents itself, right, for breast cancer risk or like ovarian or uterine cancer risk. The other thing is that that I have completely lost my train of thought. I actually managed to talk myself out of
No, but let me remind you something you said that I thought was really relevant to your question. What Dr. Gordon said earlier, which I think is really important, is that consumer-based genetic tests are not as comprehensive as you might think. And so if you were to just do that and get negative tests, I'm not sure how reassured you should actually feel. And that's why I think working with a geneticist or genetic counselor could be very helpful.
And somebody asked about it, and there are, because the barriers to getting in for like clinical genetic services have been hard, which is why we have all these novel, deliveries. If you have a personal history of cancer or active cancer, we have a walk-in clinic so that it really just to diminish the challenges. the picking up people who are coming through screening, right? This is all these models that we're trying to do. But there are online certified genetic services that are giving clinical grade testing that do allow all of that to happen from home. So again, just to help access. That is different than the cancer screening blood test that we're talking about, that Dr. Ofman is talking about. These are two. One is risk, right? And the other one is really to say, do you have cancer now? And in our studies that we're doing for our high risk, so the same thing, we're thinking about it as a year. There's some data to say, is it a year or 2 years? You have to think about like the first sweep. If we did this test on everybody right now, we would find cancers that are prevalent, that happen to be existing. But once you're kind of negative, then what is the rate of new cancers going, and what is that time interval going forward?
Can I ask a question about whether methylation patterns and other such epigenetics help us decide which therapies to use? I mean, for some cancers, there are choice of therapies. And so, as per the pharmacogenomics that was mentioned, is there a pharmaco-oncologic experience?
I mean, there's a whole field right now of epigenetic drug development. So we know there were hypomethylating agents that were used that are broad chemotherapies. So we do know that the epigenetic state is going to be very important for therapeutic choices. And right now there are drugs in development. I don't think anything's been approved in years, but there are some pretty innovative biotech companies that are developing drugs right now focused on epigenetics.
Okay, let's have a round of applause for our speakers.
Welcome back, everyone. We are so excited to bring you the next two segments, as we feel these will be heavily downloadable concepts moving forward. Longevity is such a hot button issue, and there's so much information out there. We are here to bring you the most up-to-date and scientific research in the world of healthy living and longevity. Not only that, but our experts will let you know if there are reasonable ways to achieve these goals yourself. Without any further ado, it is my privilege to welcome the amazing women who are an integral part of Have a Heart, Save a Heart's DNA to present their talk on longevity. Dr. Nicole Weinberg, Dr. Sarina Vanderzee, and Dr. Christiane Schaeffler.
All right, let's see. Move, Nourish, Rest, and Breathe, a cardiologist's view on lifespan and well-being. So I'm gonna cover the move part, or the exercise part. We're gonna break it down into a few concepts. We're gonna talk about the benefits, what does the data show, how does this relate to your genetics, since we're having a genetics and heart disease meeting, and how to optimize these concepts. So many of us know that there are a lot of benefits of exercise. It's good for your cardiovascular health, it helps with your blood pressure, it helps with your cholesterol levels, your blood sugar levels, it improves heart function if anybody's visited our cardiac rehab tables. It also improves endothelial function, so the inner linings of our blood vessels. It reduces inflammation as it relates to all these different states of disease in our body, and it also has a lot of mental health benefits. The American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association recommend exercise for all patients. So they recommend at least 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity aerobic exercise, or if you're doing more high intensity or vigorous exercise, they downgrade it to 75 minutes per week. They also are adding moderate and high intensity muscle strengthening activities, so whether that's resistance work or weight training, at least 2 days a week. They want us to spend less time sitting, so sorry, this is your Saturday, but we'll get you up and moving around. And also they're citing some even more benefits that you can derive if you're doing more than 300 minutes or more than 5 hours of exercise per week. So just to put on my Dr. Wright hat, just to talk about some of the history of where this came from, the data supporting exercise and good health is not that old. So in the 1950s, Dr. Jerry Morris linked the benefits of London bus conductors with lower cardiovascular disease. So they were comparing the bus conductors who were much more physically active to the riders that were having a sedentary lifestyle, and they compared their cardiovascular outcomes, and they saw that the conductors that were much more physically active had better overall cardiovascular health. So fast forward to today in 2024, well, this past year, Dr. Galati, who was one of our keynote speakers, who was here with a fabulous red heart jacket earlier, she published an article this year about the sex differences on not only all-cause but also cardiovascular mortality in men versus women. And she showed that women compared to men actually derived much greater benefits in all-cause and cardiovascular mortality risk reduction in equivalent amounts of exercise. So we were basically saying our women really need to exercise. They have less time to do it in, but to motivate our female patients to exercise is going to be critically important. And she has these great graphics that look at the amount of activity minutes per week that you're doing. Let me figure this out here. This is the all-cause mortality, aerobic exercise and muscle strengthening, and in cardiovascular mortality, aerobic and muscle strengthening, and the red are the women and the blue are the men. You can see across the board, women fare better with these different levels of exercise. So you may say, well, you know, in terms of the benefits of aerobic versus resistance training, even though we do know that there's a lot of benefits, there are some pivotal research studies that are mostly in rat studies right now, but we're extrapolating some of the data to humans. We know that aerobic exercise positively affects the myocardium, so it provides extra blood flow to the heart muscle, and this is extremely beneficial. So adding in resistance training to that and saying that it's going to be combined with aerobic exercise seems to also produce similar and or more beneficial effects as it relates to the heart muscle. So is this the only way that it helps you live longer? Well, no. Sorry, I found the transitional piece of the PowerPoint slides. This is not the only way that it helps you to live longer. We've been through this with our morning talks. The concept of epigenomics or epigenetics as it relates to your body and exercise are really very powerful. So this is a slide that is simplifying all the things that went on earlier today. You're not actually changing your genetic material, but you are modifying it with some of these different DNA methylation properties as well as histone modifications in some of the distal portions of your genetic material. And those are the things that we're looking at as it relates to longevity and age-related diseases. So this kind of comes back to the importance of our telomeres, and I'm sure all of you are dialing back to some of your science classes from long ago, but your telomeres are at the very bottom of your genetic material. This is that protective coating at the bottom of the different genomes here. And so as we age, that protective coating goes away, and a lot of that has to do with some of these different processes over time. The faster that you lose that protective coating, the more accelerated aging that you have. So that's obviously not optimal. But there are a lot of really good research studies that are coming out now. This is a really interesting study from 2021 looking at regular, intense exercise training and how it actually helped to prevent DNA damage, prevent telomere shortening, as well as help with some of those methylation changes to the DNA so that you would end up having longer telomeres. And so basically, the more exercise you do, the longer you live. So how do you optimize this? Well, there are things that we know alter our DNA methylation as well as our telomere length: diet, genetic predisposition, healthy lifestyle. But there is evidence to suggest that you can benefit some of these changes by training and doing more cardiovascular exercise. Your telomere length will be positively associated with cardiorespiratory fitness, physical activity, as well as your training intensity. So you will live longer if you're exercising more.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll go into how we best nourish ourselves during our exercise and other activities. For a long time, the nutritional industrial complex gave us this model of the food pyramid, which has cereal and grains on the bottom with lesser amounts of fruits, vegetables, and healthy proteins going up towards the top. On behalf of the establishment, I apologize for this. We got it 100% wrong. As we heard from Dr. Wright this morning, our current nutritional environment has led to staggering increases in the rates of obesity to the point where we now have obesity rates over 30% in 40 of our 50 states. The consequences for that as a society, and on a physiologic basis, we heard in detail from Dr. Wright. On a molecular basis, I wanted to introduce a few ideas that, with this slide courtesy of Dr. Chal, who we'll hear from on our panel, and will be a perfect opportunity for going into some detail. Malnutrition, or is essentially excess intake of fats, proteins, and other nutritive substances lead to dysregulation. We have an axis between our brains and our guts. In the process of this dysregulation, certain hormones are adjusted. Insulin-like growth factor is one, and as is mTOR, mammalian target of rapamycin. The levels of these hormones or these factors are increased. Then this has ultimately an anabolic effect, which might be great when we're young and growing, but is not what we want at most of our phases of life. There are also effects on leptin, which we heard about in detail from Dr. Wright. This is a hormone that regulates our satiety, our metabolism. We want to remain sensitive to leptin. That's a good property, and there's dysregulation of this axis as well. So is there a better way? Yes. This is a book that I've had in my office since I started practice, and I can't find any fault with it compared to with all the data that's come out in the intervening 15 years that I've been practicing. The concept, as summarized by Michael Pollan: eat food, not too much of it, mostly plants. Specifically, what's come out in the research literature again and again is that the best dietary pattern that we've studied is the Mediterranean diet, which is heavy in fruits, vegetables, with natural antioxidants, natural phytochemicals, healthy types of fats, including olive oil, healthy proteins, largely from fish, and then in lesser quantities from other types of animal sources. The Mediterranean diet, time and again, has been shown to reduce our mortality, our stroke, our heart attack rates. The black line on top is a control diet. The red and the blue lines on the bottom are different versions of the Mediterranean diet, taking into account nuts, extra virgin olive oil. Either way, the Mediterranean diet has been consistently over time associated with better outcomes. I want to bring up the concept of intermittent fasting, which has been gaining attention over the last 5 years, I would say. And the concept here is that over evolutionary history, there's naturally been a period where we're not consuming. There's the eating window, and then there's a natural fasting period where we're recovering from that process on a cellular level throughout our bodies. By restricting the eating window, there are conceptually some benefits that have been shown in several studies, including this one. In this study, restricting food intake to 10 hours of the 24 was associated with lower blood pressure, lower weight, more favorable cholesterol profiles in patients with metabolic syndrome. So this is intriguing evidence that we can come back to and discuss further on the panel as well, but could potentially be a component of a healthy, nourishing pattern. The mechanisms by which this could happen harken back to the molecules that I mentioned earlier. You have decreased levels of insulin-like growth factor, decreased levels of this mammalian target of rapamycin, and so potentially from an aging standpoint, the benefits persist here. Now, another recent trend has been continuous glucose monitoring. These devices are now available both on a prescription basis and on an over-the-counter basis. And so essentially by having a contraption in contact with your bloodstream and an associated app on your phone, you can get a continuous reading of your glucose throughout the 24-hour period. This has been very well studied in diabetics. In this study, continuous glucose monitoring over 3 months led to a reduced average glucose, better time and range, less variability in your glucose levels. So there's clear benefit in its standard of care at this point in diabetic patients for those who are glucose intolerant or who are simply trying to learn the effects of various inputs to your glucose levels, whether that's how your different macronutrients affect your glucose levels, what the effect is of exercise on your peaks and troughs. There's potential added benefit as well, and I think we need every tool in our toolkit at this point to combat the challenge that we're up against. So here's a better food pyramid. It's based on the Mediterranean diet, where the base of the pyramid is our healthy, close to the earth, natural, unprocessed foods with, again, healthy proteins. And we feel certainly that water is a preferred beverage, certainly compared to other enhanced sugar-rich or other liquids. And then we'll raise the possibility that there might be a role for some degree of restriction of the eating window, even if it's on a more of kind of a physiologic basis where there at least is some recovery time. So how do we optimize our health? From a nutrition standpoint, Mediterranean diet has the most data of all the patterns. Intermittent fasting may have a role in halting age-related disease, and glucose monitoring may be a useful tool that we'll look forward to talking about more on the panel.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about sleep today, or the rest portion. So what are the benefits? What does the data show? What's the relationship to genetics? And then finally, how to optimize sleep. So I don't know about you all, but sleep was one of my resolutions for 2025, to get better sleep. I'm not doing that well so far, per my watch, but I'm getting closer. I thought doing this part of the talk would help get me to my goal. So 1 in 3 adults don't get enough sleep. It's one of life's essential 8. So if you look at this circle here, sleep, diet, exercise, as we've talked about, blood sugar control, weight management, controlling your cholesterol, blood pressure, and not smoking. So why does sleep matter? Really impacts cognitive function, blood sugar control, also helps you with your mood, with regulating kind of your weight and stabilizing it over time, and your hormones. And so poor sleep can in turn lead to a lot of these conditions here. So Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease can be associated with it, accidents, breathing problems, hormone imbalances, et cetera. And so what are some of the mechanisms that underlie that connection? So we see in sleep-deprived individuals, you have an increase in inflammatory cytokines. Those are proteins that are inflammatory in your body, and they're increasing. And then that can get into your systemic circulation, then lead to all these processes below impacting immunity. And in cardiovascular disease, we're really focusing quite a bit now on inflammation and the role of inflammatory pathways in the acceleration of disease processes like atherosclerosis. So now in our clinic, we're frequently measuring one of these high sensitivity CRP on the right, because we know that it can really impact risk. And we actually have a medication now that recently was approved, colchicine, for a cardiovascular benefit. So there was a study done on sleep and obesity. This is a 21-day inpatient study of non-obese patients. So they got acclimated the first couple days, and then for 14 days, the experimental population got 4-hour sleep opportunity, and then the controls got 9 hours sleep opportunity. And the sleep restriction group took in more calories, about 300 calories more, but they still expended about the same amount of energy, and they gained weight in just 2 weeks. And a lot of that weight was visceral weight that Dr. Wright spoke about earlier. Whoops. So it's this weight that's really damaging by DEXA scan, and they could actually measure that. So their body weight went up, and their abdominal visceral fat also went up in just 2 weeks. So we know that sleep impacts cardiovascular health. What are some of the mechanisms behind that? So you have some of the inflammatory proteins being upregulated. It also changes intrathoracic pressure, and over time can lead to endothelial dysfunction, as we've talked about, the lining of the blood vessels, and lead to increased plaque formation. It can also increase blood clot formation. And then over time, if you did have a sleep disorder like sleep apnea, for example, you're having repeated insults to your system. And so over time, those could lead to more chronic changes. So acutely, the atrium, or one of the top chambers of your heart, has multiple kind of changes to its typical mechanisms. It's getting triggered quite a bit, and the ventricle is also getting triggered. And then ultimately that can lead to remodeling or changes in the structure of your heart. So over time, you may have, a transient apneic event, apnea meaning not getting, not breathing at night. And over time, that can lead to increased arrhythmia risk. And we see that quite a bit in our clinical practice. So this is an image showing that patients with sleep apnea have lower amounts of blood flow in their brain compared to control patients. This is from a lab that I worked in before medical school, and I was tracing various areas of the brain. This is the hippocampus, which is important in memory, particularly short-term memory. And there were actually areas of the brain in patients with sleep apnea that were starting to, in a statistically significant way, white and red are statistically significant, lose volume. And so we postulated that one of the mechanisms, we thought one reason that could be because of the lack of blood flow to their brain. And this is kind of an interesting thing, because we know the hippocampus is very important for brain function. There was a study of London taxi drivers, and people might have heard this, that because they were so great with spatial recognition and understanding, a part of their hippocampus, the posterior hippocampus, actually increased over the months that they were taxi drivers before Google Maps. So there is some plasticity to this structure that is so important to your overall function, brain function. So this is another kind of a action type study looking at blood flow throughout the brain. So recall that for that image I showed you where the blood flow throughout the brain was impaired in patients with sleep apnea. Then they were exposed to a study where they were exposed to a stressor. So the stressor in this case was like a cold plunge, so plunging your feet in water for 60 seconds. And those people with sleep apnea, and particularly more salient in female patients, were less resilient to that autonomic stressor of the cold plunge if they had sleep apnea. The females with sleep apnea, their signal changed pretty dramatically, whereas those female controls without were about the same. So even though they were exposed to a stressor, the blood flow in their brain was about the same. So there are similarities between sleep disorders and sleep-disordered breathing, patients with sleep apnea, and heart failure. There is a form of sleep-disordered breathing and heart failure known as Cheyne-Stokes respiration, and there's also a central sleep apnea that's more predominant in patients with heart failure. But a lot of the mechanisms that result from a lack of blood flow to the brain are similar. So you have a lot of the insulin resistance, your sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight system is predominantly activated with cytokines, with catecholamines, and then it causes the cardiovascular complications mentioned. So this is another study I was involved in with a different last name before I got married. And so I was actually tracing different areas of the brain, and we saw these were patients with heart failure. And we actually saw that they had multiple areas within their hippocampus, again, that structure involved in memory, that were decreasing in volume relative to controls in a statistically significant way. And so what about genetics? So we do know that there is a genetic kind of basis to chronotype. Chronotype is whether you're more of a morning lark or a night owl. So some people, even though you might tell your partner or your friends, you're kind of lazy, you don't wake up that early. Well, there might be a genetic basis to that before you fault them and congratulate yourself for waking up early. But And then we also know that genetics has a role in terms of atrial fibrillation, a really common rhythm disorder. So in this study in the UK, with the UK Biobank, there were over 400,000 participants. They were asked about their sleep patterns. And so these were the 5 kind of positive, beneficial characteristics. So early chronotype, adequate sleep duration, no frequent insomnia, no snoring, and no frequent daytime sleepiness. Those with a healthier sleep pattern had 29% less atrial fibrillation and flutter, and 35% less bradyarrhythmias. So the atrial fibrillation and flutter being an abnormal heart rhythm from the top chambers of the heart, some of you may be aware of it even personally, and then 35% have less of those kind of slower heart rhythms from the bottom, from the top chamber typically of the heart as well. And so we know that that correlates with, beneficial sleep, but then to kind of reduce that. But then the genetic risk score, which going back to what some of our speakers spoke with earlier, is created from a genome-wide association study of 134 single nucleotide variations or polymorphisms. And then we actually saw that if you had that genetic score, even if you had positive sleep habits, it wasn't as helpful for you as people with a low score. So these patients had a low genetic risk score. So healthy sleep was very protective. And if you had a high risk score, healthy sleep was still protective. There's still a signal, but you can see a little bit less, underscoring the importance of genetics. So you want to optimize your rest, get a consistent sleep schedule, 7 to 9 hours. A lot of patients tell me, well, I'm not a teenager or a young adult anymore. I don't need 7 hours of sleep, but that's not the case. All adults really need at least 7 hours of sleep. You want to keep your bedroom cool, dark, quiet, invest in a comfortable mattress. Some people are biohacking and using cooling devices on their mattresses. There's a lot of interest in this space. You want to avoid caffeine, alcohol, and heavy meals, exercise regularly, get sunlight. And then, think about that basic hygiene, think about where you are, and then long-term start to periodically assess. And if you feel like there could be an issue, bring it up with your healthcare provider. I ask every single patient about their sleep hygiene and snoring, and a lot of people say they've never been asked before. And we pick up sleep apnea so much in our clinic. So, 1 in 10 people have sleep apnea. So it would be good to, ask some of your providers if you're concerned. And then what are the steps for providers? So screen our patients, think about optimizing sleep. There is something called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is a structured program that can help you with your sleep. And if needed, also medical interventions. So we often incorporate sleep assessment tools into patient visits. Stop Bang is an easy thing you can look up online to look at your risk for sleep apnea. And then we also have referral networks with sleep physicians in our community. So because phones are a common culprit affecting your sleep, the American Heart Association came up with this nice graphic to move your device out of the way, dim your phone, set a bedtime alarm, lock it, and then block it. Anyway, that was kind of funny. And then if you want to work on your sleep, doesn't have to be overwhelming, maybe 1 week at a time, come up with something you can do differently to improve your sleep. So be active during the day for week 1, get a nighttime routine with a bedtime alarm for week 2, create a morning routine with a positive activity, and then tech-free kind of wind down bedtime. And that's it.
So for our final segment before we open it up to the panel, we'll be talking about how to understand and reduce stress, and no discussion of health, well-being, and longevity in 2025 would be complete without this. The stress response is a deeply ingrained, evolutionarily very old response. If you think about what the potential benefits of this are, imagine being chased by a bear. How do you feel? You're alert, you're focused, you're ready for physical performance. The blood flow to your muscles is high, your heart rate is elevated. You're very focused, not necessarily on what's on the periphery, but on what is right in front of you. You're motivated to protect the survival of yourself and those that you love. Now, what is the physiologic basis of that feeling of stress? Several key components. The autonomic nervous system is a marriage of different systems that that connect your brain with every organ in your body. So the sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight component of this. It's what turns on, revs up There's a chain of neurons that goes from your brain through your spinal cord that fire like a chain of dominoes. And then there's a complementary component of hormonal activation in addition to the neurotransmitters released by these nerves, and that's called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And so you have both neurotransmitters released, you have hormones released, and these are being released in seconds on fast forward during this threat. The counterbalancing system, the parasympathetic nervous system, has a slightly different physiologic basis. There's a large nerve called the vagus nerve that also has nerve endings on many of our organs. This is the system that's your rest and digest. If you're not under threat, this is what helps you break down your nutrients, rebuild, repair, reproduce. And so during the stress response, the parasympathetic nervous system is on pause. So there's a cortisol response that affects all of our organ systems. We can feel very palpably what's happening from a cardiovascular system. For example, I know my heart rate right now is about 120, but heart rate increases, blood pressure increases, and this is what it's like to be under stress. So this is an absolutely essential system, but I would posit that it's not necessarily designed for 2025. It has allowed us to survive over time, but to some extent, we may have gone off the evolutionary rails. Our genes have evolved over the course of millions of years, and our contemporary society is changing at the course of minutes to days, and those are a little bit mismatched. We haven't had time necessarily to evolve to bring these back into line. Our work, living, physical, social environments are unrecognizable compared to 100 or even 30 years ago. And our genes haven't been able to keep pace. And as a result, I think we can all feel that there's more anxiety, obesity, metabolic dysregulation, sleep dysregulation than we've ever had before. So the stress, in addition to less physical activity than we had previously, other environmental insults, infections, and other factors lead to molecular and cellular alterations, the deregulated nutrient sensing that we talked about earlier, inflammation. And so as a result, we are aging faster, and these, in terms of the conditions that we treat all the time as cardiologists, are on the rise as a result of this, in part. So let's talk about the tools you can use to bring your autonomic nervous system back into line in a way that serves you better. Now, the beautiful thing about breathing is that you can control it. You can decide to breathe in a certain way. When you breathe in a certain way, your diaphragm, the muscle that controls the size of your lungs, can move. And if you lower your diaphragm, you're opening your lungs, that makes your heart bigger. That bigger heart sends a signal to slow the heart rate down. We can use this to our advantage. If you are exhaling for longer than you're inhaling, you can lower your heart rate. So let's try it. We're going to do a two-part inhalation. A long inhale through your nose, a short inhale to top up and open your alveoli, and then a long sigh. Let's do it together. So my heart rate is now down to 110. Hopefully yours has come down too. You can use techniques like this as an emergency response when you can tell that you're in overdrive out of proportion to your environment. Other emergency tools, courtesy of the American Heart Association, in addition to deep breaths, stopping before you react, a quick meditation, waiting before you respond to something in an emotionally driven way, walk away from the situation, break down problems into smaller pieces, engage your senses of touch or connection, or work out or do something active. I would over the long term, I would like to, in managing your stress beyond that initial emergency response has some additional components that I want to mention. And ultimately, the goal is to hit play so that all the components of your nervous system are engaged in an appropriate response to the environment. To this end, I want to introduce the concept of hormesis, or good stress. So there are moderate levels of good stress that help your body adapt rather than harming it. So exercise we talked about at length, ordinary fasting at least, physiologic heat and cold exposure all have a common effect of coordinating and engaging your natural adaptive response as long as the stress is not too intense or too prolonged. Additional tools that I would want to mention, mindfulness, gratitude, connection, are other tools in our toolkit for keeping our stress under reasonable levels over the long term. So in conclusion, how we exist in this world has evolved over millions of years of evolution. Our bodies may know better than our modern minds do in some way how to handle this because the body has had more time to adapt than our individual brains have. There's a collective memory in our genetics and in our physiology. So it's important to know your genetics and your genomics and to know your lifestyle. There are certain genetic conditions that we talked about this morning that simply need certain medical interventions, medications, procedures to treat. But lifestyle changes are profoundly effective, even more so in individuals with high genetic risk. And lifestyle changes can profoundly affect our epigenetics and almost every aspect of our physiology. So treat your genetics, optimize your lifestyle, and please think of your questions for the panel. Thank you.
That was such a great talk and lends itself nicely to our much anticipated biohacking panel. If each of you would please introduce yourselves, tell us something briefly about your clinical interests, and then we'll get into all of the great information.
All right, I'll start us off. Hi, good morning or good afternoon now. I'm Sarah Kate McGowan. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm in private practice. I also do some work for a healthcare organization in Los Angeles, and I specialize in behavioral sleep medicine.
Okay, very good. I think many of you know who I am, but in case you don't, Dr. Rigved Tadwalkar. I'm a partner and consultative cardiologist here with the Pacific Heart Institute. I wear a number of hats in the practice. Probably what's most relevant to today's panel is that I'm directing our brand new cardiac rehab, which I want to make a big plug for our facility and the gains that we've made in the past several months, and I'm looking forward to participating.
Hi, I'm Noah. I'm an endocrinologist. I work in Pacific Neuroscience, and I'm mainly focused on neuroendocrinology. But in my personal life and also in the clinic, I am very pro yoga, lifestyle, diet, nutrition. I feel like as a doctor and specifically endocrinologist, this wholesome lifestyle approach is extremely important and to aging.
So many possible questions here. What are things that this audience could take from you in terms of how they can achieve the sleep that we just heard about? What are the best interventions beyond the common things that people know, and how do you help patients with that?
So I think the first thing to keep in mind, and something that the presentation did a really great job highlighting, was just the importance of sleep, prioritizing your sleep. It used to be that I would have to stand in front of audiences and plead with them to take their sleep seriously. We used to have a culture that really valued not sleeping, and the belief that if I was sleeping less, that meant I was more productive during the day. And I think over time and where we are now is we know as a culture and a society that we have to have sleep to be able to function during the day. And not just having some sleep, but having optimal sleep. So I think the biggest thing that I would recommend is prioritizing your sleep just like you prioritize diet and exercise and healthy living in other ways. And there's a lot of ways to do that. So the presentation gave some great examples. Make sure that you have enough time to sleep, you know? Make sure that you prioritize protecting enough time at night to sleep, just like you would protect time for an important meeting, time with friends and loved ones. And then when you don't have issues with sleep, following sleep hygiene are going to be really helpful strategies. Consistency. Go to bed around the same time, wake up around the same time each morning. Make sure that you have a wind down. You know, sometimes we think about sleep like a light switch. You're either awake or you're asleep, but it's more like a dimmer switch. So you need to do some activities for half an hour, 20 minutes, 45 minutes before you go to bed that start to promote feeling more rested, feeling, you know, less anxious and more prepared and ready for sleep. Wake up at the same time each day, no matter what. This is a really hard one, but it's actually one of the most important things that you can do for your sleep. And then the last thing that I'll say, because I could talk on this for the entire panel time that we have, is know when you are crossing the line between healthy sleep and disordered sleep. So things like, are you starting to struggle staying asleep 3 nights or more per week? Are you starting to have a lot of daytime sleepiness? You're falling asleep while you're watching TV, you're falling asleep while you're having a conversation with somebody, feeling really sleepy during the day. Are you having other symptoms like you're being told that you snore a lot at night or it's really, really loud? Are you having some strange things happening at night? So anything that you feel like isn't within the realm of normal is the time to go see your healthcare provider, because we have a lot of really helpful interventions.
Dr. Tadwalkar, you have a lot of knowledge about technology in health and wearables for tools. Do you have any opinion about their use for, one, determining if your sleep is healthy and sufficient, or two, improving it when it's not?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I've essentially tackled this topic to some depth at each of these conferences, and it's like every year the tools get a little bit more sophisticated as it relates to wearables and digital health. And what was previously kind of like a blanket catch-all recommendation, which was, okay, just take it with a grain of salt and then, you know, we'll kind of validate things clinically, is increasingly becoming a blurry line. And so it's interesting because many of these devices and the technology surrounding it, especially with the explosion of just advanced techniques like artificial intelligence, machine learning, things like that, and advanced algorithms would probably be the best way to put it. We're getting better at characterizing patterns, and that includes sleep, with common wearables, seeing that these companies are big, you know, multinational, you know, organizations, right? There's a lot of interest in trying to have that sort of data. So what I'm finding even in the clinical space is that when people bring this data to me, I'm taking it much more seriously than I ever did before. Now, with that said, when it comes to these common things, you know, what I often will try to guide people with is like, hey, you know, they'll say, I feel great and I think I'm getting great sleep, but my wearable is telling me that I'm not. You know, what should I do? And you know, I say, well, how do you feel, right? And so these are really important things to remember. Like, you know, everyone knows their body well, right? So you really want to take some of that data with a grain of salt still. But you know, it doesn't hurt, you know, to have trends for us to sort of look into, and those are always reasonably important to bring up when you think they might be a concern.
Thank you. Dr. Tal, I often get asked by patients, can you refer me to an endocrinologist? I'm tired all the time. I can't sleep throughout the night. Something's wrong with my hormones. Can you check these levels? When may it be a hormone issue? What can they check, or should they be seeing you at all?
Yeah, so probably you send them to me because I do have a lot of patients coming with issues with their sleeps. And first of all, I need to see what the associated symptoms are. Are there symptoms that suggesting maybe they have elevated cortisol that can cause insomnia, if they have elevated thyroid function, which can also cause insomnia, and others. But many times it's not that. And many times, even so in more younger patients, around 20-30s, the sleep hygiene is a very big topic. I find myself, as an endocrinologist, when I rule out all the abnormal endocrinopathies, to discuss the sleep hygiene, to make sure that the cell phone is out of reach for at least an hour before a nap or before we go to sleep, to discuss meditation, relaxation technique before you go to sleep, because I feel like that our current lifetime, our stress in our lifetime prevent us. Maybe we can fall asleep quickly, and this is actually something that I hear a lot. People fall asleep quickly, but they do not sleep through the night, or they wake up and cannot return to sleep. So maybe we fall asleep quickly because we're so exhausted from this crazy life, but we cannot maintain it because we're in front of the cell phone, and the blue light basically makes our melatonin not to secrete well enough, so we cannot prolong the sleep. So I discuss that a lot.
For you, Dr. McGowan, when the other side of it, when do you tell a patient, oh, maybe you should be seeing a physician, or maybe we do need medications beyond behavioral therapy? And then if you can talk a little bit about the behavioral therapy part of it.
Sure. I mean, I think by the time somebody has come to see me in my office, they have some symptoms that are concerning to them. So I start with a really thorough evaluation. And so part of that is I'm trying to get a sense of what's contributing to your sleep issues. And so that's both a behavioral question, walking somebody through a 24-hour cycle. What are they doing before bed? What's happening during the night? But then it's also asking a lot of questions to rule out medical symptoms. So are you showing signs of sleep apnea? Sleep apnea is a pretty common sleep disorder. One thing I wanted to mention from the talk is that the symptoms of sleep apnea actually look pretty different in men versus women. So really similar to heart attacks, the symptoms for women aren't the traditional ones that we see for men. And so for that reason, it oftentimes goes underdiagnosed, untreated. For most people, but for men in particular, the classic symptoms are things like snoring really loudly, witnessed apneas, meaning that your bed partner is saying, hey, you stopped breathing for a few seconds there. I was really worried. And then you took this big gasp and you started breathing again. Women certainly have those symptoms, and when they do, we rightfully are concerned about sleep apnea. But women might look different. They might be reporting things like, I'm just struggling to get through the day. They might have more symptoms of depression, insomnia, that they still might be good candidates to get tested for sleep apnea. Now I've lost track of the question you were asking me. So doing a really good evaluation, medically, psychiatrically, is there anything else that we're missing? And then I'll refer accordingly. So if I think you have a medical sleep disorder, I'm going to refer you to a sleep specialist. I'm going to refer you to a cardiologist. I'm going to refer you to an endocrinologist to get some lab work done. But ruling all of those things out, if I think you might benefit from a behavioral intervention, so you have insomnia, let's say, then I'm going to provide you the gold standard treatment, which is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia.
I use or have used, and for patients, and get questions all the time from patients about continuous glucose monitoring. How can that be useful for these patients? One, just to be healthier or looking to, improve their longevity, like we learned about with diet and exercise.
So diabetes usually is diagnosed pretty late. Sometimes, or many times, patients already have other symptoms, including involvement of the kidneys, of their eyes, and so on. And that because we just don't know that we have elevated sugars, because we only feel it when it's already progressed. Having the glucose continuous monitor, even if you don't have diabetes, can help you get a clue where your sugars are, and maybe you can have an early diagnosis. Also, I think we talked about it before regarding nutrition. Nutrition is a very, very sensitive subject. I follow plant-based diet. I believe in high carb, whole food plant-based diet. And sometimes when I talk about with patients on that, and they like keto diet or high protein, sometimes it can feel like uncomfortable. And I agree, maybe it doesn't work for everyone. Maybe someone can benefit from protein. But what I'm trying to say is that putting a CGM on you, you can see what makes your sugar go high, what makes it go down. Like sometimes maybe someone can benefit from protein, someone can benefit from brown rice and so on. So really checking your individual, like we're saying, medicine is becoming very, very precise, very, very individualized. So just see what works for you. What makes your sugars high, your sugar low, and also the pattern.
So I actually have a really good question, which I'm sure a lot of people are thinking of. So should everyone have a CGM or use it at some point? So I've gone to these social events and I see people just kind of randomly wearing CGMs. Actually, one of my endocrinology friends, and him and his fiance were both wearing one, and they're just like, oh yeah, we're just doing it for a week to kind of see, you know, what different foods kind of trigger our blood sugars, which I thought was like a little elitist actually in a way. But, so I just wanted to know, what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely as a trainee, I did it as well. Yeah, I think it gives you a lot of information about like what makes your sugars go high. If I eat a pear or a banana or I don't know, not a steak because I don't do that, but other foods. Yeah, definitely. I think that at least for like a couple of weeks, a month, just to see where you're at. Yes, definitely.
So here's a question for anyone who wants to respond, just in terms of longevity and all of the trends with podcasts and books. We're hearing about all sorts of things. Do you have any thoughts or opinions about, and I'll let you pick because some of them are not the easiest topics, cold plunges, infrared light, saunas, rapamycin, you know. You can
Okay, so this is, I'm glad you asked that because this is like a day's worth of, you know, information to discuss. And it's interesting because now you can go online and hear about all kinds of stuff, you know, but here is actually something that's interesting that is, you know, I think like what it is sort of like a blending of like what is trendy and like also like, you know, kind of pseudoscience in a sense too, in some cases. Now, that's not to say that some of these things could have some benefit, but I think the degree to which those benefits are sort of, you know, expressed is definitely false. So what's interesting is that I think in a study, they found a good 40 to 50% of information that was out, that is health information on social media, is actually infactual, like not factually accurate. And that's really alarming when you have Gen Zers who are primarily getting their information from social media. And for example, I think a third of Gen Zers are actually getting their information from TikTok. So for which is kind of interesting, right? Because for everyone who sort of is in the Google generation, like let's go Google something, the youngsters are actually going to TikTok and social media first. And a good third of those individuals are not even verifying it. So we have to be very, very cautious about this trend. And I think as healthcare professionals, you know, it's very important to start debunking some of these issues. Now, I guess you brought up a few different things. One thing I will sort of say that I think does have some value and benefit and is not studied enough is actually the cold plunges and saunas, et cetera. In fact, a lot of the literature for these specific activities comes from Scandinavia. And they've actually been studying it in great depth, you know, and even from a biological and clinical standpoint, there has been some literature to show that it can be beneficial, particularly in recovery, as opposed to in sort of the active phases of activity. So there may be more to explore there. And I'll let everyone else sort of take the rest if you're interested.
I just want to add regarding to what you say that we don't have a lot of clinical human data on what intervention really helps longevity. There's one trial now on medication, on metformin specifically, that is undergoing now to see which, if the treatment is really gonna help longevity. But otherwise, I don't think we have good clinical data.
So I've had a few patients go to these longevity centers in, I think they've all been in New York City that I've seen so far. Yeah, exactly. But anyways, they come back thin, trim people with very low A1Cs on semaglutide, you know, these weight loss medications. Is there any data to show that super low blood sugars, you know, very low A1Cs improve longevity, you know, beyond diabetic versus not diabetic?
How low?
I guess that's my question too, but they'll be like 4.5, in the fours.
That's a good question. I don't think there is a data like that. We do know that diabetes in itself can increase the susceptibility to other age-related disease and to other morbidity and mortality. But again, it's also two different questions, because if having A1C of 4.5 is beneficial for longevity, I would say yes, probably, if it doesn't involve malnutrition. But the question is if A1C, because of Ozempic, leads to longevity, that I don't know. I don't think we have any clinical data on that. But I think there are some evidence that showing that the GLP-1 and other anti-diabetic medication like SGLT2 are starting to pick up as maybe longevity medications as well.
I will keep going, but if anyone in the audience has questions.
Well, I just want to talk about people who live in the blue zone. So you've been talking about great information, all this technical body stuff. People who live in the blue zone live into their hundreds, so they are active, they dance, and they listen to music. They eat food without preservatives, like in Italy and in Greece and Costa Rica. They have a lot more joy in their life, and they're really integrated human beings, body, mind, and spirit. They're free from so many social norms. They don't care what they look like. I mean, they're not obese. I mean, they're walking and riding horses and they're 90. So there is a lifestyle that, in my opinion, says to me, we have to look at the human being as body, mind, and spirit. We can't just talk about diet. We can't just talk about activity. Because if we're obsessive about our eating and our diet, it doesn't make us healthier. These people from what I've seen, and I've been in Costa Rica and I've been around some of the people in the blue zone, it's so inspiring to me, and it seems to go beyond science. It's, there isn't a lot of data about it, but it's a fact. People are living to their hundreds when they think of themselves as an integrated human being.
I agree. So when they do talk about the blue zones, they talk about 3 specific aspects of life. Like you're saying, it's very holistic. So one is the diet. The second one is movement and exercise. Not specifically exercise, but just to be active, right? Go to the grocery and don't drive there. And the third one is community and sense of belonging. And with our devices in hand all the time, like the interpersonal connection is somewhat limited. And I agree, we need to keep it simple. Keep it simple in our diet, keep it simple with our exercise, with our community. We don't need to rush too much. And when I was listening to their lectures, I thought like everything they're saying, it's already been said and done in other Eastern medicine, like in Indian medicine, in Chinese medicine, all the diet, this exercise, it's the restfulness, everything, it's all already been said. The Western society, the Western medicine is just waking up now.
It's a very interesting point. Sometimes I feel like we're sort of creating a bit of a blue zone, given sort of like what my patient population is like. But I think that people are just very well informed, and this is actually a really important point, which is that not every place is going to be a blue zone, right? Like, let's just be honest, right? Like, some places are never gonna achieve that level of community, homogeneity in terms of values, diet, activity, etc. And this is like really a great point to bring up when we're talking about biohacking, right? Because we're all looking for like these little techniques that might contribute to making us, that one individual who sort of is kind of like a blue zone participant, right? And so some things that I would sort of mention, like on the exertion or activity end, that are really telling, and also are incorporated into these societies that are in the blue zones, are a few. So one is this concept that I like to share with my patients. It's called VILPA, VILPA, which is Vigorous Intermittent Lifestyle Physical Activity. This is actually saying that even 1 to 2 minute bursts of activity throughout the day can significantly improve your cardiovascular health. And not even just soft endpoints, we're talking about mortality. So for somebody who's really just not doing much, even the stuff that you would consider to do in terms of running errands can actually be a really big boost. So that's like, choosing, like, we use the grocery store example, walking to the grocery, walking with your grocery bags, walking up and down those flight of steps instead of using the elevator. Like, those kinds of things incorporated throughout the day are so much more tangible for many people and can lead to substantial benefits. The other, I would say, if you can't be consistent with your activity, is having it done on the weekend. So some people have very rigorous weekday schedules, right? I mean, let's just face it, some people are just in office work where you're just sitting for long periods of time, or for whatever reason, you just have to commit to sit. But if you can actually get those 150 minutes, those magic 150 minutes that we sort of recommend, or AHA recommended, and do it over the weekend, there is data that suggests that you will still have a good outcome and you will still get those same protective benefits. So there's all these little small things. There's different types of HIIT training. A lot of it is not even the time spent. A lot of it's just how you use your time. So one I like to share is called 4x4 HIIT training. So what it means is that you sort of go full intensity with an activity for 4 minutes, you rest for 4 minutes, and then you do that 4 times. So we call it 4x4 HIIT. Really simple, right? I mean, you don't need anything special. You don't have to be rich. It's just very simple stuff that if we just start to incorporate here and there can really make a strong difference in terms of longevity. And so, again, not everybody's in a blue zone, right? Maybe none of us will have an opportunity to be in a blue zone for whatever our personal circumstances are, but we can all incorporate these kinds of things to help us with our longevity and health.
2 follow-ups to the simple interventions. One, as the director of cardiac rehab, we have these amazing medications in cardiology that have prolonged people's lives by decades. And I feel like the newer medications we get now are good, but it's like we're improving your outcomes by 0.5%. Can you just give a quick review to people about the benefits of cardiac rehab for
Yeah, absolutely, definitely, and that's thank you for the segue. Yes, now that we do have this wonderful, beautiful program for cardiac rehabilitation, I do want to mention a couple of points that are of high value. Right now, nationwide, only 20 to 30% of eligible individuals for cardiac rehab actually even go. Okay, so as it is for something that is known to be so helpful in terms of cardiovascular outcomes, the vast majority of individuals aren't even getting there. And only a small percentage of individuals who actually get there actually end up completing the sessions and actually going through it. But this is actually a fairly dramatic statistic and will be, much more robust than even some of the more newer age therapies that we have, is that for those who complete the full 36 sessions that you're sort of allotted, you can have a 50% decrease in cardiovascular mortality, 30% decrease in myocardial infarction. We're talking about really dramatic statistics for real endpoints. So it's super important to have that sort of structured program. I've taken care of patients who after their procedure, or we do PCI or whatever have you, valves, and they say, well, I think I can do this on my own, or I think I'm going to try to get active on my own. And unless they really have a true history of being able to do this on their own, and their baseline was really dramatically high, and they were sort of doing a great job with their activity, I essentially force these people to go through cardiac rehab. So it's one of those things where we talk about all these new therapies and pills, but again, this is kind of a biohack in a sense, because again, it doesn't have to be fancy or sort of take care, take advantage of our biology or anything like that. It's just really a matter of just getting out there and getting active, which all of us can do.
But I hear, not that infrequently, I'm just so tired. I'm not getting good sleep at night. I'm too tired to exercise. What do you say, Dr. McGowan, to that comment?
Yeah, and I think I'll answer that with kind of going on with the theme, which is, I don't want to be the wet blanket here, but I don't know that there is a biohack. There's no hack to a lot of this, right? There's healthy living. There's not a hack to sleep. I don't have a way to have you sleep less and have more energy during the day. or sleep less and be more productive. I don't think there's a way where you can not exercise and figure out a way to get some benefits from exercise. What it is it's about balance. It's figuring out, how do I prioritize these things in my life? How do I prioritize the things that are important to me? And I can go through the list, my family and my job and my friends, like what's important to me. And my health is part of that. How do I think about the different parts of my health? And then how do I make small changes towards those goals? So health, exercise, I know is important. We've just seen all of the statistics on it. I go to these conferences and I get really excited. I'm like, I'm gonna change, I'm gonna exercise, 30 minutes every single day. I'm gonna put it into my schedule. I'm gonna eat healthy again. And then a week later, I'm like, oh, this is so hard. This is so much, and I do none of it. So I don't think it's about figuring out that one hack. If I just did a cold plunge, then my health would improve. I think it's about figuring out broad strokes. What direction do I want to head in? What direction do I want to head in with exercise? Right now, I'm not doing a whole lot of exercise. Okay, can I commit to going for a walk for 10 minutes today? Yeah, I think I can do that. Okay, can I try and prioritize my sleep a little bit more? Okay, what would that look like? That might look like I'm going to turn off my phone at 9 o'clock. And figuring out those small goals that I think I can actually achieve towards this larger end of my health. Okay, I look at my diet, I'm gonna make this one change this week, and then maybe next week I'm gonna make another change. So I think it's just about figuring out the small, achievable changes that I can make in the short run that over the course of my life are gonna make a really big difference. And when you think about a ship, a 4-degree change doesn't look like I'm going in a different direction, but in the long run, I end up in a completely different place.
I actually have a question. Yeah, that was wonderful. Yeah, we should definitely applaud that. Yeah. So it's interesting because there is some data that shows okay, well now if you're participating in aerobic activity, that's going to improve your deep sleep, your REM latency, those kinds of things. So I guess my question is for sleep and just more generally, do all of these things feed into each other? So let's say I'm doing exercise, am I getting improved sleep, and then therefore I'm feeling better, and then that improves my glucose tolerance. So, how does that, feed into that?
Yes, thank you for asking that, because that was the question that was asked that I decided to just go in a completely different direction. So yes, exercise is gonna help your sleep, right? So the more that you are active during the day, the more you're building up your sleep load, your desire for sleep, it's gonna help you at night. Now, exercising right before bed isn't going to help you. You want to do vigorous exercise at least 3 or 4 hours before bed. But yes, exercising during the day is going to help you at night. It all feeds back into itself. So the more active I am during the day, the better I'm going to sleep at night. The better I sleep at night, the more energy I'm going to have during the day. But again, this isn't like you have to do, train for a marathon in order to be able to sleep. It's just changing what you're doing a little bit more. Do a little bit more exercise than you are right now, and I think your sleep will likely improve as a result.
So I just want to add that, when you don't have enough sleep, your cortisol level will run high, your ghrelin level will run high, you'll eat more, you'll be more sluggish, you're not going to do the physical exercise. It is a physical cycle that we have to cut. And once we start one step at a time, like you said, it's gonna help eventually. And I think another point that you said, I'm doing it for 1 week and then I'm stopping. Well, community goes right in here. If you have enough people around you that do the diet that you do, or healthy diet, physical exercise together, meditation together, yoga together, whatever it is that works for you, then it's easier to prolong it. And this is also part of the blue zone.
Yeah, and I think for those who, have difficulty with that, and having that community, this is actually where, the social media and all these other things, sort of what you decide to kind of surround yourself with in terms of information can really sort of put you on that track too if you don't have that level of community, and I think that's an important point.
We have a question over here, this poor lady, she's been waiting.
I have a question about supplements. I've been told to take vitamin B12. As you get older, I guess it's depleted. And it's methylated B12. I'm just wondering if that methylation that you were talking about early correlates with methylated B vitamins, and would you recommend?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the methylated B12. Do you know? I'm not sure.
When it's methylated, it gets absorbed
Oh, okay. Do you eat meat? Do you eat dairy? You don't eat B12.
I actually often find now, so for a while I was actually just routinely almost checking B12 in my standard laboratory panel. And to be honest, I don't know if I had a great reason except that it would come up often, or patients were concerned about energy levels. I found more often than not, and maybe this is a population bias for us here on the West Side, most people were actually super therapeutic. Like they were getting way too much vitamin B12. And it's like, I'd have to ask them to just stop it altogether or, at least cut it in half. So you probably don't need the supplementation just, as a blanket statement.
Yeah, if you have like other disorder like pernicious anemia or other, diseases that cause intrinsic depletion of B12, then there's not really a need to supplement if you don't have those.
We have a question back here.
Yes, there's been a lot of data today, and a lot of it, I'm sure, is based on research. Is any of this from federal grants? And if so, are you at all concerned if there's going to be the money and the staff to continue some of this research?
I feel like longevity is a hot topic, and I think research, but there's always this concern for sure.
So I'm trying to decide if I'm going to share one of the places that I work. I'm a VA psychologist. I work for the VA over here at West LA, and I don't know what's going to happen. I am concerned about what it's going to mean for research and what we're able to study, and I don't know what's going to happen.
I'm actually a little bit concerned that we're going to see a different era of research where it's going to be sort of more non-sort of federally driven type of research, and I think with the rise of with social media and sort of like these big personalities sort of driving healthcare in a sense, what decides to get funded and by who, and how that narrative sort of gets pushed is going to be like a very interesting era from what I can see.
One thing I realize I have to state in disclosing that I'm a VA psychologist is that everything that I say here today are my own beliefs and thoughts. They're based in science, but I do not represent the federal government in any of my answers here, and I'm not representing the VA today.
Could the panel comment on the benefits of a daytime nap?
Great question. So if you had asked me this question even a few months ago, I would have said generally what we know is that you want to preserve your sleep for the nighttime. So unless there are extenuating circumstances, you generally don't want to nap during the day because you want to be able to save all of that sleep so that you can sleep consolidated during the night. However, there's a lot of new research coming out in the benefits of naps. And so the truth is it's going to be an individual difference. For some people, naps aren't going to be so helpful. So if you're taking naps during the day and you're finding that you're having trouble falling asleep and staying asleep at night, I probably would start by reducing napping during the day. But there's been some research that there are some people who are historically people who have napped during the day, and it doesn't seem to impact their sleep during the night. Now, when I say a nap, I mean like maybe 20 or 30 minutes during the day. I'm not talking about hours on end. But for some people, it might be perfectly okay for them to take a 20 or 30-minute nap. Now, if you're going to nap, the best time to nap is about 7 to 9 hours after you wake up. From a circadian perspective, we have a natural dip in our circadian alerting forces that happen about 7 to 9 hours after you habitually wake up. So that's typically going to be the sweet spot. You don't want to sleep too close to your sleep time because you're more likely to go into deeper stages of sleep, which have a greater likelihood of impacting your sleep at night. So like most things, the answer is it depends, and it depends on individual differences.
I actually have a follow-up on that, which I think everyone would hopefully would find of value, and actually for both of you, which is that, so there are obviously days when I'm definitely like, okay, postprandial, like, okay, like I am definitely need to get past this drive to sleep. And then there are other days where I'm not because I've been A, well rested, or B, my lunch was a little healthier, or maybe I ate a little bit less, had a little bit less animal product, whatever have you. So I'm always kind of wondering now, is the fact that I need to nap in the afternoon, is that a marker of poor health in a sense, or is it poor metabolic health that the fact that like I need to do that? And I'm just curious what your thoughts are from that perspective.
I think that what you said is true. Probably it's okay for some people and some people not, and also depending on the day. But the question is, why are you needing this nap? Because you have obstructive sleep apnea and you didn't sleep throughout the night, or because you had like this huge meal and lunch and you have this insulin coma. So what are the reasons? And I don't think you can say it's like it's okay, it's not. You have to investigate what's going on.
And similarly, I would say I probably wouldn't look at it as today versus yesterday. Like I wouldn't feel like the need to take a nap today and say, gosh, what does this mean? And try and investigate it. I would look over a larger period of time. So over the past month, at least twice a week, I feel like I need a nap. That seems like a change for me. You're kind of like looking at more evidence, more data, rather than saying, today I feel very sleepy right now. What is the exact cause of today? I might not be able to answer that question. I might be able to answer, this seems to be a growing trend for me and it's leading towards sleep disturbance, or I'm having some other symptoms that are more concerning.
So on that note, I have a couple of patients in their mid to late 90s who's very concerned adult children bring them in, and they're always, Mom sleeps 12 hours. What's wrong with her? What meds do we need to give her? Can we let Mom sleep 12 hours?
My answer is always, it depends. It depends, right? There's no blanket, this is okay or not okay. 12 hours is a lot.
Even for a 95-year-old?
12 hours is a lot even for a 95-year-old. That would be a reason that I would be a little bit concerned, especially if there's been a big change. Most of the sleep is happening during the day. It's not happening at night anymore. Again, if there's been a big change, if there's like a sudden increase, a sudden decrease in somebody's need for sleep, that's a good reason to get checked out. My parent is starting to take a 20-minute nap during the day, but otherwise they're functioning just fine and they're still engaged, and I'm not worried about any changes in cognition. Then let them have the nap.
Okay, this question is for Dr. Tadwalkar. I am a patient at Pacific Heart for many years, and I got excited when you talked about cardiac rehab center. And my question is, first of all, when I would see that this center is open, I got very excited and walk into the elevators. But do you have to have a cardiac event to attend this? Because I have issues, and now I'm retired. I have Medicare and whatever, and I can get things, but I'm like, I don't know, do I have to have a major event? Or if I have issues, can I come for some therapies of some sort?
Right. So, traditionally speaking, it's a great question, and thank you for asking. So, there are specific criteria that are known nationwide as being sort of qualifying events or things that sort of lead to cardiac rehabilitation. Generally, most people who have been to a cath lab and have had some form of procedure will often qualify. That includes stable coronary artery disease that we're treating with maximal medical management, patients who've had heart attacks, who've had some sort of percutaneous coronary intervention, so balloon angioplasty, stent placement, that sort of thing. And of course, we've really ramped up our volumes for aortic valve replacement, so transcatheter aortic valve replacements, other sort of valvular procedures. It also extends to patients who have chronic stable heart failure and they're well optimized on medications for about 3 months or so. So there are specific criteria which may or may not apply. Now, with all that said, one of the things that we're hoping to do as we expand services is to sort of bring this, and expand sort of the patient pool or whatever have you, to sort of incorporate more of that wellness element, because we can see that many people find this form of structured rehabilitation or just exercise to be of high value as compared to just going to a gym. So, I think that's something that we're looking at, in this year. But as of right now, we are sort of mostly sticking with, those guidelines. So more to come, and stay tuned. Yeah, we can talk offline. Yeah. I would say, though, we are actually very interested in bringing atypical populations into the fold. So I've talked to one of my colleagues at UCI who also I do a lot of pericardial disease work. We've talked about, so traditionally the recommendation for pericarditis patients or recurrent pericarditis patients is that they restrict their exercise. But, we always wonder, can a low level of activity still be of value? Like, is there really value in just kind of sitting? And we know from other cardiovascular conditions that we don't want people to sit. We want to get them active. So there are some other populations that we think could benefit. So I'm always willing to think outside the box. I think so long as we can make it happen. So let's see.
That was a great discussion full of lots of gems. Thank you, panelists.
As many of you are well aware, we're a charity that supports other charities. This year, more than ever, we feel so grateful for those around us and in our communities. We've decided to support the extensive, remarkable wildfire efforts affecting our community via the amazing work of Widows, Orphans, and Disabled Firefighters Fund, managed by the LA Firemen Relief Association. We invite their president and an LA Fire Department fire captain, Christiane, to join us on the stage. Thank you. We are so proud to do our part in supporting those who put their very lives on the line serving as firefighters and their loved ones with this donation of $5,000 and present them this check so they can keep providing essential care to firefighter families like they've been doing since 1906. It's our way of kind of helping families of firefighters injured or killed in the line of duty and facing other crises. Chris, if you'd like to say a few words.
Good afternoon. My name is Christiane, and I currently am the president of our association. Our association has been around for 118 years, and our main purpose is to serve our active duty firefighters, retirees, and their families. It's about 15,000 people total. With the recent fires, we have a total of 28 families that have been affected, both in Eaton and Palisades. Some of those have lost their homes, and others are displaced. And so we're tasked with really helping them put their lives back together. And it's going to be obviously a journey. Many of you in the room know somebody that's been affected by the fires in some sort of way. So I can assure you we are very grateful for an organization like you to donate this money. Your money is 100% going to these families. And there's so many different areas of financial need, whether it's housing, relocation, clothing, just some of the basic needs. And those needs will be here for probably 2, 3, 4, 5 years to get these families back together. So we're extremely appreciative that you would think of us, and are very grateful for your donation. Thank you very much.
Well, you guys, today's event has been the result of a year of planning and over 11 years of support. Only because of you we're able to come together amidst what has been such a difficult start to 2025. Tackling a mission as big as ours is something that we quite literally could not do alone. We want to thank everybody today who made this possible, our volunteers, our event staff, our exhibitors, raffle donors, AV team, and Casa Del Mar. We would like to give special thanks to some of our very special donors, Tamara Rowett, Barbara Bowman, the St. John's Foundation, and every person who gave every single penny to our cause. We thank you so much for your participation. We thank you for your energy. We thank you for your support, and we mean it from the bottom of our hearts.